If you are looking for urban screens, then that is the sunroom terrace. Well, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Shaara Ainsley, and I'm with an organization called Long Live as Kings, which is based in Seattle, Washington. It's a nonprofit that does salmon conservation work. But I worked in and lived in Santa Cruz for many years before that, so I'm back in my hometown. And then my co-chair, Sherri Norris.
Hi, my name is Sherri Norris. I'm with the California Indian Environmental Alliance. We work in mostly Northern California, but really statewide for water quality objectives.
So we, just a little bit of housekeeping to begin with. Because of the number of talks we have in our session, and because we are like basically a pass-through room, we're gonna try to align our breaks with their breaks in the sunroom terrace. So that gives us some odd breaks here and there, which I encourage you, since it's a session on collaboration, to go and network during those odd breaks. So we'll have two 10-minute breaks before the break that's actually on the schedule. So that'll give you a lot of time to network. And then each talk is about 23 minutes long with a couple minutes transition, so that 23 minutes includes time for questions. And then if we have time at the end, we're hoping for a panel discussion. At the very end, so that would be around 4:45. So session speakers, if you can, stick around, that would be great. So this is a session on salmon and climate change. And the focus here is on collaborative efforts and tools to inform collaborative efforts. And so a future in which resilient salmon can flourish and salmon populations can support harvest in the face of climate change depends on a recognition of our social and ecological systems, of diverse sources of knowledge, of innovative science and policy, dramatically increased funding, and well-informed climate resiliency planning, and then significantly greater information sharing across a wide geographic range, which is why I'm all the way here from Washington State. And to do this, we really need an unprecedented expansion in our collaborative engagement and our abilities to bring together information from different knowledge sources, such as Western science and indigenous knowledge systems. So the first two plenary talks really provided a great foundation for this session, and I'm so appreciative. Kellex mentioned Wade Crowfoot's quote that winning slowly on climate change is losing, and she noted that part of the solution is this collaborative, really leaning into collaboration to make progress. And then Frankie Myers, and oops, see, I knew I was going to do that. That's what you prefer. And Frankie Myers emphasized that what we're learning now is the TEK of the future, and really understanding that we should be sharing those lessons learned, right? And so the presenters in this session will begin by providing examples of collaborative approaches and processes, and then later in the session we'll move into tools that can be used to inform those collaborative processes. And then our hope is that we'll have enough time for a short panel discussion where we can kind of broaden that back out and talk more about collaboration. And so this is our vision for this kind of hourglass-shaped conversation this afternoon. And Sherri, is there anything that you wanted to share?
Good.
Okay. So with that, we are going to, Sherri and I are kind of sharing the first talk slot. And we are going to be talking about developing collaborative solutions to address and plan for climate impacts on Pacific salmon. And so I'll give the first 10 minutes or so, and then Sherri can give her 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have a brief time for questions, and then we'll move to the next talk. And the clicker works really neat. I swear it worked. Okay, maybe it doesn't. Rolling with it seems to be the name of today. Okay, so Salmon and Climate Initiative. So first I'll be talking about a new and collaborative salmon and climate initiative that's under development. And this normally is like a 20-minute talk, so I will try to be concise, which is not always my strong suit. But we've been working for decades on salmon recovery. And the impacts of climate change are accelerating, and they're further stressing Pacific salmon populations that are already in crisis. So our group, along with the Kings, is working with a core team of organizations, including the Pacific Salmon Foundation up in Canada and Salmon Defense, which is a nonprofit started by Western Washington tribes, to develop a salmon and climate initiative. And this is to bring people together to take a regional approach to helping salmon become more resilient in the face of climate change. So effective stewardship of salmon can be defined as having robust and resilient salmon populations that support thriving ecosystems, indigenous rights and cultures, and local economies that depend on salmon. And traditional stewardship of salmon by indigenous peoples maintained resilient salmon populations since time immemorial. However, modern society is not on their trajectory to achieve these outcomes. And climate change is really making that path to success more difficult for us. And unfortunately, the current level of spending, at least at my organization, we believe is just a drop in the bucket of what we need. So if you look at the back of the envelope calculation of the GDP of the Pacific Coast states, and that includes BC, you're looking at almost $5 trillion, and that was an estimate in 2021 by our CEO. And if you compare this to the annual PACSR funding at about 65 million, that's really a drop in the bucket. And if you think about all of this GDP generation, a lot of that are things that have a negative impact on salmon. So the effort that we, and the financial investment that we're putting back into recovering salmon really should be much larger. And so, I thought I checked my slides, but anyways, you can do the math yourself. We're saying even if you multiply that by 100 times, would that be enough to generate what we need to bring back our salmon populations? So we're at a crossroads in salmon recovery. We've been working really hard individually at the watershed level, but as a whole, collectively, we haven't been able to take actions enough to make meaningful enough recovery. And so from each of our positions, the way that my colleague up at DFL in Canada described it, it's like we're driving in the fog and we each have a head beam in front of us and we can see part of the view individually, but we can't see it all collectively. And so if we can come together under a larger, broader initiative, we can provide a new approach for salmon resilience in Western North America. So we think that we need to be thinking big and build something that's innovative that can significantly shift salmon recovery and bridge some of these silos that have historically occurred between these different entities. And the idea is to really overcome the usual silos, not by leveraging what we're already doing, so the good work that we're already doing at the watershed level. Can we leverage that up to the regional level? And when I say regional level, we're thinking very broad. So climate change is affecting us from Alaska all the way down to California in this Pacific salmon habitat of North America. So we need to be sharing information, thinking of solutions broadly as well. And also, it's a way to address this climate anxiety and doomism, right? So it's important to feel that we're part of a community, that we're making a difference, so that we can stay in that positivity blue section of this wheel and occasionally dip into maybe the outrage and the anger, but hopefully not the fear and sadness. So, you know, we feel it all a little bit, but we want to be in that blue section. So why do we think that this is possible to be so highly collaborative? Well, my organization and the Pacific Salmon Foundation, our partners in Vancouver, collaboratively worked on a project called the Salish Sea Marine Survival Project. And that was great precedent for this kind of thing at a much smaller scale of the Salish Sea, which is what we call the Puget Sound up into the Georgia Straits. And that was a project in which we had one primary question, which was what are the factors affecting juvenile salmon survival in the Salish Sea? And we brought together over 200 different researchers or knowledge holders from 60 different organizations to do 90 different studies to address this. And that kind of collaborative scale was huge and made a big leap in progress. And so we think that a similar approach could be applied more broadly. So the proposed approach is to establish a collaborative framework with a core team of partners, and they're offering kind of a project management, and we're guided by a strategic plan, and then a coordinating committee, and they all support numerous partners throughout this broad region through phased actions implementation. And so the proposed strategy is really focused on a couple different kinds of actions that we think are suited to take at this kind of regional scale. And we're also hoping that by working together, we can make a collective case that increased overall funding for salmon recovery is necessary and is available. So our hope is that this initiative supports local and regional salmon recovery planning and builds capacity both for salmon populations and the communities that depend on salmon. So this is intended to provide kind of a little schematic of the kinds of actions that we're looking at. So on the horizontal axis, it's like experimental, non-tested kind of salmon recovery actions off to like shovel ready. And then on the vertical is large scale, so that's California to Alaska, to small scale being the watershed level. And so up in the top right quadrant are the large scale actions. So these are things that we really are in agreement on that they need to happen. They can have more of a regional scale impact, and we just need to address limiting factors that could be addressed with more collective support. And then on the bottom left are really experimental things that maybe people are doing in each individual watershed that could be better coordinated across the region so that we can test these locally and then scale them up or at least share out the successes and even the failures, right? So we talked about this morning the importance of understanding our failures and sharing our failures too. So we brought together some folks in April 2023 to talk about the initiative and consider how we could further the initiative development with a big workshop. And then in December 2023, we brought together 70 knowledge holders, managers, and practitioners. And we did a lot of brainstorming around what are the kinds of activities that we could do collectively at this broad regional scale. So a few of those examples are working together to build a common understanding of the problem and uncertainties. So this goes hand in hand with what they were saying this morning about making sure that you're on the same page of the goal, right? What is the goal? Well, we heard from a lot of folks in the workshop that you also have to be on the same page of what is the problem, right? What are the challenges and uncertainties we're experiencing? A second one is leveraging our collective outreach. So there's a lot of talk about how salmon just need better PR. As my CEO says, we should be selling salmon like we sell Coca-Cola, right? Like salmon do amazing things for our ecosystem. But we don't have that, you know, we're restoration practitioners, we're fish biologists, we're not marketing experts, right? But we can bring in marketing experts. We should be figuring out how to diversify our thinkers and leverage our collective power of each of our individual organizations, social media, things like that, to share a similar message. And then another example is creating a database of life history and genomic diversity across this broad range. So this is more of a technical example, but it could help us to identify life history tactics that are successful or not successful, given the current climate and conditions in that basin, and link that with the habitat in that basin, and help us to understand, okay, this is where you're at in 2025, but my basin might be there in 2030, 2050, and what about my spring run? You know, to be able to have that broader look. So we are in the process of developing a strategic plan for the initiative, and it's going to look probably like you would expect. There's going to be like the vision and goals, call to action. We're also going to have like a communications plan, or operations plan, and then we have separated out the actions planning. So this is kind of the framework, and then we'll work on the actions planning afterwards. So this is kind of hot off the press. We have a strategic planning committee that we've assembled of great folks that are helping us to come up with the strategic plan. And when I say we have a core group of folks that have been working on developing this over the past 2 years. And I put them at the end in the thank you slide, but now that I'm saying it, probably makes sense to start with them so that you all know who's been involved. But these are the values that we've come up with. And I just want to highlight the respecting multiple ways of knowing and building on that type of knowledge, and being salmon-centered and action-oriented. So there's these drivers of being action-oriented, but not losing that focus on salmon. So we have 4 different themes, or what we're calling streams, and they can be looked at, and this is how the project manager brain, this is how I had it. You know, you've got your 4 themes, and this is how my colleague drew it. And I was like, oh, that makes more sense. So you have connect, communicate, invest. Connect is about connecting us, connecting the practitioners, connecting the managers, the knowledge holders. Communicate is more about communicating out to the public, to decision makers. Invest, that's pretty obvious, and that's something that we're suffering from right now, is understanding how to increase that investment in salmon recovery. And then act is taking action is a combination of all of those. And then we've developed a strategic goal for each of those 4 streams, and then objectives in mid-range and advanced for those. So how can SEI benefit your work? So we are hoping that this is something that can benefit all of us. We could provide a compelling case for additional funding. Unfortunately, that made sense putting on the slide 6 months ago. Now it feels like I need to say compelling case for retaining the limited funding that we have. Fighting for what we have and hopefully someday growing the pie, but it's been a very different experience in the last 4 months. Providing a cooperative environment to continue these efforts, and then sharing information, sharing approaches, and supporting kind of a collective analysis and reporting out. So one of my colleagues has suggested something like an IPCC style report that you can send out to folks like decision makers that's kind of simplified, 10 pages or less, that really summarizes what is the state of the salmon across this region, and what are the impacts of climate change we're experiencing now, and what do we expect in the future, what can we do about it. So I just want to leave you with this idea. We're trying to create an initiative to build connections, to learn from each other, to communicate amongst each other, and to communicate with the public and decision makers about the need for salmon and what they're facing under climate change. And we want to develop a new and innovative ideas and build resilience and deploy these throughout the range of salmon. So I will pass this along to Sherri, because I think that she provides an example of a collaborative effort that's, at a smaller scale than the Alaska to California, but is the kind of thing that the Salmon and Climate Initiative could be amplifying and elevating and sharing about. So I just want to thank you all. I'm with Long of the Kings, and our partners, Pacific Salmon Foundation and Salmon Defense, are helping to put this together. But we have a wonderful core team of folks up here who have been instrumental. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. So what I'm going to talk about is the Northern California Tribal Consortium for Climate Resiliency. It's kind of a crunchy title. But it was a collaboration between, I gotta advance here. A collaboration between multiple tribes, Oncorhynchus, the Blue Lake Rancheria, Robinson Rancheria, Dry Creek Rancheria, and Kashaya, and Sia. And all of us were talking about climate and the work that needed to happen internally for tribes to prepare, but also in working with our neighbors, and the counties and cities and the state itself. And we were looking at all the materials that were out there, and it got dang crunchy pretty quick. I mean, there's a lot of tools and a lot of information. So how do we comb through this? And if any of you are work with tribes or are a tribal member or work within the tribe as staff, the tribes in California specifically range from a very large tribe to a very small tribe. So you'll have one person that wears 10 hats, or you'll have multiple departments that need to intersect with each other. So when you're wearing all those hats, you don't have time to read all those materials to try to figure out which methodology or which tool you're going to use. So this was our attempt. We spent about 2 years going through everything, and I'll just let you know what the outcomes were. Our outputs that we came up with, I'm going to go into these in a little more detail, but there was the work plan itself, and for each of the tribes, as I mentioned, the different tribes have different individuals within their structures, so we had to figure out who we needed to have in the room to have these conversations. And then there was all the data to crunch through, doing all the research, reading about all of them, and identifying which pieces were good, making little summaries for each one of what you would find when you went into the document, so people don't have to go in and look at everything themselves. And then we came up with a framework that takes us through the process of creating both a climate vulnerability assessment and then creating a climate plan. And so then all the tools and the resources, and we ended up coming up with a portal. And then we realized one of the very first things that needed to happen was that ArcGIS needed to be a tool that people were ready to use actively. And then each of the tribal partners chose which of the tools and resources that we came up with that they would pilot. Trying to get there. Oops. Okay. So we came up with, our portal is found at California or CA Tribal Climate Resiliency Resource Portal.com. NCTCC was already taken, sorry guys. It ended up with the framework, which I mentioned, and then the tools and a resource library and trainings. And then this is the first frame, so when you go into that resource portal, this is what you see, is it step-by-step climate planning for Northern California tribes. Others, of course, can use this. The framework itself, Climate Action Resilience Plan Framework, we call it CARP. It takes you through a step-by-step process, which I'm going to not get into details with, but I am going to show you it, the outline, and then you can see what pieces are living there. So one is to understand your exposure. And in order to do that, community participatory research is really important, as in any community, but in particular with tribes, you have families that have specific pieces of the knowledge. And then when you bring the whole tribe together, or as many of those families as possible together, then you come up with a picture of what really is happening and what needs to, and what pieces haven't had an opportunity to be shared between families in a long time. So we developed the survey in such a way that it would be, the community would be able to answer the questions, but then also that staff and council could do questions, and then climate change concern, where you rate the concerns, you pull those pieces together and rank them. So what happens is staff and council, we would recommend that they take the test first, because it kind of lays the groundwork for what research should be happening while the community is being surveyed. But they were there, some of the questions overlap, but we just found that it made a lot more sense to not have one survey. Then, analyzing and interpreting the data. We wanted the community to be involved in analyzing the data. Because if you read just graphs and charts, sometimes you might be missing a nuance of what that output means. And then the biggest piece is identifying the hazards, and then, as I mentioned before, is pairing those assets, like what does the community have to work with, what resources are available, with the hazards. And so that ends up becoming a risk matrix, where it's like give the high level, low level, where do things live, what do you prioritize to work with sooner. The vulnerability assessment is really, it's from the community. We wanted, then you go into these community truth check meetings. Like, this is what we're seeing. This is the community participatory research. This is what we're seeing. Does this resonate with you? What are we missing? And then it moves into looking for the climate resiliency plan. And that's where this climate resource library that we put onto the website really helps. And aligning it with existing plans. So there's information in there on tribal plans that other tribes have created. So for example, I was talking about this morning, Yurok and Karuk, their plan's going to have a lot to do with the restoration, salmon restoration, also a lot to do with fire. And particularly the Karuk tribe has really got a lot on their plan about fire. So we tried to make little summaries on, if you go into this plan, these are some of the high points that this plan will hit for you. And that way people could use these as templates. And then interviews and focus group planning, and how to get in there and have those community meetings and have focus groups on some issues, areas of concern. That resource library has over 200 pieces of data in it, and I'm going to show a slide about that one in a moment. So then you're moving into your plan development, and you're writing out outcomes that you'd like to see. And we wanted these to be implementable, like you can implement actions based on them, so it's an actionable plan. And timelines, so short-term, long-term, etc. So that's all in there. This is the library. So there's over 200 sortable open source resources. Our concern is a lot of them are federal, and their websites have gone down. So we did do, Michelle's here with staff, we did do a deep dive to try to pull as many pieces that we could, and that way, as we're about ready to go through and see which items have been scrubbed and have to do each month, and try to upload the things that were stagnant that we could continue to share. But that is a huge concern that we've lost a lot of our federal partners and federal data. Doesn't mean that it's gone forever. There's also, I've been hearing from other nonprofits that they've been, NGOs, that they've been grabbing data and holding on to them. So I think at some point in the future, you know, when we start finding holes, we could send emails out to people and say, do you have this? Do you have that? Because we're missing the holes. We're trying to make sure that the information is available. And it's arranged so that you can, by the steps that are in the plan development that we just talked about. Sorry, that slide is, that screenshot isn't real clear. And then, so it goes through the steps, but then it also has additional filters that are based on whether or not it's sea level rise, or whether it's saltwater intrusion, or whether you're looking for species, whether you're looking for county plans, whether you're looking for tribal plans, but you can go in and start to dig around. We are, within the next 3 years, going to be revamping this because the search engine works, but we'd like it to be better. And so we can make it more user-friendly. But right now, it is there, it's all there, and if you do have any issues finding anything, you can always, our emails are going to be at the end, and you can email us and we'll help you navigate through it. The back end is an Excel spreadsheet that has everything in there, but this is the sort of little front-facing piece. There. So back to that community participatory research piece and the surveys, because that was one of the steps. We also created some tools to go along with it. Like a tracker sheet, so you could track, you know, so you're doing, because of the information you're gathering, there could be some HIPAA concerns, so we want to make sure, like for each survey that you do, it has a number, and the people's names are separate. So this survey tracker helps you to track, you know, what numbers goes with what names, and they can be never distributed together, kind of a thing. And then you have your survey definition sheets. We recognize that for some tribal members, they would call a fish one thing for the tribe, and among the community, and then externally it has a different name. So we wanted to have pictures, and we wanted with names of the fish, that so people could really be talking apples to apples when we're comparing things together, and there's some continuity between the responses. And then that visual reference spreadsheet that I mentioned. The definition sheet. A lot of the terminology that we use in sciences, you know, the community members, all of our, you know, lay community members don't always track with them, so it's just able to give whoever's asking the questions to have consistent responses to what a specific term means. So we talked about a moment ago about the surveys and refining it for the community and having community discussions and a feedback loop that's in there. Ethnographic interviews, so you could have an interview with an individual and really get good info from them. That's really important for elders. It's also really important for youth. And so youth and elders in community meetings coming together and having these focus groups are really important. And I say all of this when it comes to tribes because tribes are constantly being asked to provide traditional knowledge or TK, and it's not that one, you know, those answers are not always readily available because we've been told for so long that the information that we have is not useful to Western science, and Western science knows everything, and you guys don't know anything. So families have taken that information and kind of pulled it in. Also, it can be misused, so people haven't been very comfortable sharing it. And so just to be able to have that space to go inside of your own people and your own community and tribe-to-tribe conversations, and then once there's a comfort level with your vulnerability assessment, your climate plan, then you can go out and look at the other tools that then compare it with your neighbors, have some conversations with them, compare it with the counties, and overlay your plans and see how the tribal climate plan can integrate into the other plans and vice versa, especially when it comes with emergency response. A lot of the tribal communities, there's one road in and one road out, and if there's a fire or an emergency, how are you going to get out? And who do you call? And does that agency respond? Because also California is a PL280 state, so the feds, or not the feds, in some cases, yes, it's Bureau of Indian Affairs land, or it's BLM land, or it's federal lands. But the jurisdiction becomes messy, and so it's really important for the tribe to have that communication and to maintain it, because then councils change, leadership changes in agencies, just to maintain that, and that's part of your plan for climate. We did some mapping, and we were so happy. That's a lot of what Michelle worked on, was getting those mapping courses together. We had Seth LaRosa, who has worked with tribes, and he's a UC Berkeley graduate, and to work with Sonoma State University for their geology lab. We just found out that with all of the cuts that lab has lost funding. So So we're currently getting ready for the next round of our work, and if anybody has knowledge of a lab that could house us or host us in the Sonoma County, Mendocino, or Lake County, or Sonoma County, that whole area would be wonderful. We would definitely go further north, but we have Cal Poly up there that we think that we could work with, but we do need something further south. And we were able to both teach it at beginners and intermediate, and then have hands-on work. So go back and work with your tribe, and then a few months later come back for the next course. And we want to continue to do that. It tells the story of what's happening. Geospatial, even just learning about how to read maps is really important. And so we intend to continue with that. The direction we're headed, it very quickly moved into species resiliency. For tribes, it's the responsibility that we have in our place-based cultures to take care of the landscape, and for the landscape to take care of us, and that reciprocity is extremely important. And as we're looking at species crashing, or figuring out how they're going to travel across roads, or when they have too few of them and now they don't have the diversity to be able to maintain a really healthy population. So we did the very beginning conversations where we brought in Western scientists to have conversations with the tribes that were part of our coalition to work on beaver restoration, for example. The restoration of watersheds and beaver is really tightly connected. It may become very important in California as we lose our snowpack and we need to restore upland meadows. Beavers could help to slow that and cool that water. And so then we also went through ocean kelp and sun stars and mountain lions and elk ranges. And there's studies about roads and travel that can be overlaid in your mapping. And then the UN Convention on Climate Change. We work with the Indigenous Environmental Network, in particular because of the COPS treaties, and there's the danger of cap and trade. A lot of our fire work in the state of California is funded by cap and trade. And it's an elephant in the room, we're using that money, we need that money, but at the same time, is it really reducing what's happening globally? We have not done the balance sheets to see that, and that's something we really need to start looking at. It's a hole for us in the future. I'm getting ready to wrap up here, so I wanted to tell you about a project that we're working on to continue this work with the Salmon Restoration Federation. In particular, they wrote a grant for capacity building. So we're going to be working with tribes in the North Coast on supporting their administration to be able to administer grants and to develop the plans to develop coastal watershed and cultural resilience goals. And we are ready to move into a planning grant phase. So we can find projects, identify them, and move those forward. A lot of capacity building and deep dives to move forward the work that we started now that we have tools developed, and to revise that resource database. So for more information on that, you can contact the executive director of our SRF, or Michelle Rivera, who's over here. This is contact information for them. And that is me. And you can reach out to all three of us. And that's what I have today. It's just showing, kind of our internal process for helping us to navigate things, and then hoping that we can, next phase, start moving it out a little more wider.
In the hot sun in this room for this talk. And thank you for the introduction, Shaara. So I wanted to start off my talk with just an acknowledgement that we're maybe not in the blue, positive, emotional area that Shaara referenced earlier today. A lot of us are feeling a lot of fear and a lot of sadness right now. And people are really hurting. And so I kind of wanted to name that. Laws that protect these waterways and species that we love are being dismantled. Funding keeps getting pulled left and right. And so many colleagues are retiring. I know a lot of people wanted to be here and couldn't be here. So I just wanted to name that and give folks an opportunity to take a deep breath, make yourself comfortable, and we don't have to fight it, we can be there. And this is something that I think is really appropriate for the time right now. This effort that I'm going to be talking about offers some good news and some solutions in a really complex and pretty depressing time. So today I'm going to introduce you to the Reorienting to Recovery project. talk about the problems and the needs, which y'all are going to know all about. It'll be good just to have it clear for everybody. The opportunity that presented itself that allowed us to create this project and be successful. The project plan, approach, and phases, so just kind of the nuts and bolts of how we came about, like trying to tackle this really big, really complex issue of salmon recovery in the Delta, especially thinking about climate change into the future. I'll talk about the outcomes and the accomplishments and lessons learned, which is where really the stretching into the whole phrasing comes. So I'm just going to throw a softball to everybody in the beginning, and if you end up really not liking this presentation, hopefully you can at least remember these 4 things and walk away with these. So the structure of the process matters. How we put things together, how we bring people in, how we facilitate it, all of that is important, and I'll get into all these. Don't reinvent the wheel. There's been so much amazing work done, whether it's in the lower Shasta, it's in the Delta. So many people have spent so much money and decades of their careers figuring out how to attack this problem, and it still isn't working. So we need to build on those and not just start fresh. Create efficiencies across geographies so that information can be interrelatable and comparable, and so we don't have to try to, again, reinvent the wheel in some of these smaller geographies and really burn a lot of people out and funding in the process. And then the funding must match the scope of the effort required. And so, again, to kind of echo Shaara, it feels a little tone deaf right now to say that, and I think being really clear about what the needs are is really important as well. So the problem, this is a little bit dark, and again, you all know this, but despite a ton of work and a ton of investment, salmon in the Delta are in precipitous decline. And why this is happening, there's no single regulatory space positioned to recover salmon. It's really piecemeal according to these different regulators, according to these different groups, different geographies, different species. And so it's hard to have this framework that's big enough to understand and attack this really intense issue. Management actions for the 4 H's, which are hatcheries, habitat, hydrology, and harvest, are applied incoherently. And so we think about these different actions, but they're very piecemealed. Again, so there's not this larger framework in how these things can relate to each other and play off each other and can help work together to create solutions. And so if these efforts aren't working now, they're definitely not going to be working in the future when climate change is throwing all sorts of curveballs at us. We're already seeing this, and we can expect it to get more intense as the years progress. We also have a fractured society, culture of oppositional politics, a lot of distrust for a lot of different sides, a lot of different individuals, limited forums for dialogue across difference to try to shift that energy at all, and many conversations are lacking key voices. People are always trying to put out these little fires, so there isn't the opportunity to dream bigger and to have those folks who can really make a difference and put their weight behind some of these efforts come to the table and weigh in. But in the Delta, there is this opportunity that came from convergent evolution. So we have the Collaborative Science and Adaptive Management Program, CSAMP is the acronym, and it already expanded the focus beyond the biops, beyond a specific regulator, to salmon recovery as a whole. And so there was a lot of uncommon dialogues that happened in that group. Some of the dialogues that happened were between my colleague Renee Henry at Trout Unlimited and Jennifer Pierre with the state water contractors. And with those organizations, many times in these different groups are talking against each other and saying, hey, this is how we can protect salmon, or hey, this is what we can actually do, this is what people need. And we were having this kind of headbutting thing. And Renee and Jennifer got together and they said, actually, we both want to recover salmon. We just don't know how to get there, and we have really different understandings of things like science. And so we wanted to try to break that silo and started to build off of the relationship that was there. I don't know if tequila was involved, but there's no tequila in this situation. So I hear that, I'm like, all right, you all have fun. There was also really diverse support for CSAMP. So from different agencies, from the state water contractors, from DWR. So folks already kind of knew, hey, this effort has been going on for a while. There's some energy behind it. There's some of these key players in it. And so R2R was really able to grow out of that diverse support. We also had a real great inspiration and precedent from the Columbia Basin Collaborative. So folks within my organization, Trout Unlimited, had been involved in the Columbia Basin Collaborative, and we were able to have that communication and cross-pollination so they could say, hey, this is what really worked. And they said things like, you really need some good facilitation. You really need to bring that big group together and have that inclusivity. So that was a great precedent. And so from all of these different pieces, a vision for the Reorienting to Recovery project was born. And so what was this vision? It was a new, non-regulatory, transparent, and inclusive, it's a mouthful, process to develop a broadly supported scientific definition of salmon recovery. So this is pan-regulatory, this isn't just NIMS BIOP, this isn't just what CDFW or the PIA is saying. It's something that's outside of all of that, but is building on it. We also created a summary where we wanted to create a summary of other key values that would be impacted by these salmon recovery actions. And with that, we could create a common value set and understand beyond salmon recovery, what are people looking for? What are people concerned about? What do we care about? We also wanted to create a salmon recovery scenario that integrated the 4 H's, habitat, hatcheries, hydrology, and harvest, pulling those all together, understanding how they related to each other, and then equitably distributing the pains and the gains associated with the turns of these different 4-H knobs, equitably distributing the pains and gains across the range of values. So it wasn't just the fishermen who were having to give it up. It wasn't just the farmers. It was a equitable distribution. And with this, the most important thing was to really create a holistic, comprehensive vision for salmon restoration. So we have that North Star, we know what we're working towards, we know what needs to be done, and we can all push together in the same direction and start understanding how these different projects, how these different pieces can be put together, moving us toward that vision. And it's important to have that buy-in and support, and that's why the process is really important. So, thinking about the process really mattering, what does that mean? The project planning team was excellent. Some of us are here today. A lot of us have become really good friends. We had enough redundancy built into the project planning team so that if somebody needed to step away from maternity leave or move to a different organization, that there was still enough consistency to move things forward. And we all became friends, and there was this positive, generative energy that we created that then rippled into the different workshops and different gatherings that we had. And that was really important too, because things did get messy. Things did get sticky for people within the planning team and for different groups that we were working with. So having that solid team consisting of facilitators, modelers, scientists, structured decision-making experts was really key. And then the actual approach. We had 3 different phases. I kind of talked about what the vision included with those different objectives. And so to meet that, phase 1 was to come up with, we defined salmon recovery. And it was pan-regulatory. It was based off of work that was already done, but it was new and it was done in a collaborative environment. Then we collected and distilled values in different workshops and in different questionnaires. And then we developed recovery scenarios using structured decision-making and salmon life cycle models that were already in existence that we were able to build out. And participation and engagement was really important in every step of the way. So in phase 1, we had the scientific advisory committee. Phase 2, we had the forum, which was really the biggest table that we could create. I think it was hundreds of people who ended up coming to the workshops. And then for phase 3, we had the forum was involved, the scientific advisory team was involved, and the structured decision-making working group was involved. So those were representatives from a lot of different interest groups. And to match all of this work, we had really diverse funding as well. So our definition of recovery included the viable salmon population parameters of diversity, spatial structure, productivity, and abundance. And Tommy Williams talked a lot about that today. For each of these, we had objectives, metrics, and targets. And it broke it down from these kind of vague ideas to really specific numbers that we could then put into the salmon life cycle models. And And then in phase 2, we harvested the values. This was a really fun, important part of the process because we had these workshops, again, tons of participants, and people shared their stories related to salmon and why they cared about salmon. They talked about their dreams for salmon. They talked about stories from when they were younger and they saw salmon for the first time. And we really kind of got beyond where they're working or what they're trying to work on to figure out what do they care about, why are they spending their time working with salmon. And I know for me it was really nice because I was in so many groups before this where it's like, okay, this person's working for this group that, they're trying to work towards different things than we are. And it was nice just to hear, okay, this person has had a different path that's landed them in this different position, and they've had a lot of the same experiences in terms of seeing these fish spawn and being like, wow, these organisms are incredible. And so that was really heartening and created a lot of good energy and built a lot of relationships. And it was just nice to break out of this oppositional politics type thing and say, hey, we care about these fish and we can work together. So that was a fun process. But we also wanted to keep it inclusive. So some people didn't have the funding, they didn't have the time to show up. And that was something that we've really taken away that's important, is that regardless of how people show up, it doesn't necessarily reflect how much they support the project. It just is a reflection of how busy they are and what fires they're trying to put out. It's not a reflection of how easy or hard they are to work with. It's really up to us to stretch and figure out ways to meet them. So to do that, we had a lot of questionnaires too. So if people couldn't come, we could just say, hey, please fill this out so your voice is still heard, so your values can still be incorporated. And so we ended up collecting over 560 individuals' value statements, and then we went through a process of distilling those down to make sure they weren't too repetitive, and we had 18 different decision objectives, is what they ended up distilling down to. And so those were different metrics that we could put into the model related to where fish were, how much water there was, how many fish there were. And so we were putting those into the salmon life cycle models again. We also had a lot of process values. And so those are values that can't really get put into a model or measured in the same way. But when we're thinking about building these different collaboratives, it was really important to have things like education and inclusivity. And that was a really important aspect as well. We haven't integrated that as much, but we're going to hopefully in the future. And then for phase 3, we really focused on using the structured decision-making process to create a recovery scenario that A, met the salmon recovery definition as defined in phase 1, and also equitably distributed the pains and gains across all of the different values that we collected in phase 2. And so we developed and refined scenarios. The first round of scenarios were called bookend scenarios. And that was when we turned the dial on each of those 4 H's all the way up. So we said, hey, if we had the most natural flow regime possible in all wet years, what would we get? If we were to totally turn off the hatcheries or max up the hatcheries, what would we get? What would happen if we totally turned, if we stopped harvest permanently, what would happen? And what we saw was that none of those single actions got us to recovery. So that was really key because we said, hey, it's not just one thing. We can't just do this step approach. We can't just turn off the harvest. We need to have a combination and we need to be able to work together. So outcomes, this has been exciting. So we had the VSP parameters to define recovery, and in that process of phase 1, we really built the trust and we had this consensus approach. So if somebody really had an issue, they could do the thumbs down. A lot of times consensus is defined as like thumbs up or thumbs down, and that kind of exacerbates this transactional type of interactions. But what we sought to include was kind of this, okay, we'll go with it, we'll do the middle thumbs approach, and that opened up a lot, like that simple change opened up a lot of conversation around, okay, why are you here, how can we get you here? And it really, that's part of what we're talking about when we talk about the transparency. It's like giving that space for people to share what they're thinking and to try to bring them on board, not in like a manipulative way, but in a way that helps build that trust and helps people understand each other. And then from phase 2, we had these over 560 value statements. We refined to the 18 objective categories related to water, land, salmon, ecosystem, other species, and money. And then we have these process objectives. And then from phase 3, we found a recovery scenario, which is very exciting. We call this the platypus. And we identified and consented on for advancement for further refinement. So this one met salmon recovery, which is huge because we talked to so many people who said, hey, all of these models that we had been kind of building, the salmon life cycle models that we were building out, they were really like decision support models to look at individual projects. But the way that we updated the model, it was, okay, how can we actually move to this North Star of salmon recovery? And so that was great to say, hey, salmon recovery is possible if we do these things. And so we can understand, using these tools, how different actions, like healthy rivers and landscapes, for example, can move us forward towards recovery, but maybe won't get us all the way there. So to start kind of landing this plane a little bit, we modified and made available the salmon life cycle models for 4-H integrated planning. Here's the QR code if anyone needs it. Shout out to Liz Stebbins, who's here, who did a ton of this work. She works with Flow West and gave an awesome, I'm sure, presentation yesterday. And this stitched together the different H's. It helped create that coherency, that integration, and comparability that's important when you're creating a big frame to try to incorporate all of these different regional disciplinary efforts that are happening. We also set expectations for planned efforts. It seems like a lot of times there's an effort, it has a lot of energy, and then it doesn't get us as far as we want to, or the fish are still aren't doing well, and there's kind of this like, oh, you know, this energy that goes down, and a little bit of, what's the word, just folks are burnt out and folks lose hope. And so this is a really good way to understand how these pieces can fit together and set expectations. We also had cross-pollination with other large efforts, which was TU and other people within the organization, working with the Columbia Basin Collaborative, Salmon Climate Initiative, and trying to share some of the things that we had been learning with other folks as well. We also had our first iteration of communication tools for a broader audience. And this is something I haven't talked about too much today, but it's really important to try to bring people along. Those process objectives that I mentioned, the process values, it's hard to incorporate those into the model and to understand those within like the framework of salmon life cycle models. And they're still really important, so we created these beautiful story maps which talk about the current impacts on salmon, how people connect to and care about salmon, and what we can do to shift the path forward. And really what's at risk. So many people don't even know that salmon exists in the Delta. So many people who live within the Delta. And that was something that came up a lot in this conversation is how can we try to sell that Coca-Cola or whatever and try to get people more understanding of what's at risk. And so what are the lessons learned that can support advancing a climate resilient recovery approach for Pacific salmon? And this is those 4 things that I hoped you would remember at the beginning of the presentation. The structure of the process matters. So transparency around values expands the opportunity horizon. And that transparency is both really simple, telling the stories, allowing that space to be vulnerable, like Frankie Myers was talking about earlier and Tommy Williams, giving that space for people to just say, hey, this is what I'm trying to do, beyond the organization, beyond my name tag, this is what I'm trying to work towards, and allowing those relationships and that energy to flow. It expands the opportunity horizon. So instead of just thinking like, you know, back and forth, compromise, it can open up new frontiers for working together and for finding some solutions to these complex problems. It also helps create a common picture of the world and common objectives. So it's not just, hey, we need to work on flows, we need to work on flows, we need to work on flows. And flows are really important. That's not the only piece that we need to think about. And so working together on that. Inclusivity is so important to the process. And inclusivity, again, it's simple. We need to invite people, we need to put that extra time in. And it's really complex because some people, they're trying to put out the fires. And oftentimes, this came up a lot for us. The people who are most traumatized and most impacted by salmon not doing well are the ones whose voices we need the most. But they're so, like they're in this state of fear and of trauma that they can't really plan for 20 years down the line, which is what this project was really trying to do, is creating that larger vision, creating that North Star. It wasn't putting out a fire, it was trying to vision the future. And so we really needed to have a lot of engagement, flexibility. So meeting when they wanted to meet, having those extra meetings, having the one-on-one phone calls, and just meeting them when they're at, and making sure that there's people within the planning team who can meet those needs and who can interact with those folks. The structured decision-making process was huge. The facilitation, professional facilitation, having somebody who's not engaged in the process in the same way, who has skin in the game, that they want the process to be successful, but they're not representing an organization in any way, is so key. I've worked in collaboratives that have that and that don't, and the ones that have the facilitation are always much more successful. But this, requires funding. And together, all of these different aspects allow people to stretch into areas that maybe they don't usually go personally and organizationally, and we can think to figure out how we can really meet salmon recovery. Don't reinvent the wheel. Uplift, integrate, synthesize what is already happening as opposed to replacing and just cycling that energy, not moving us forward. This helps keep people consistent and engaged. Create the efficiencies across geographies. We use these life cycle models. We're really lucky in the Delta to have that. They don't have those life cycle models in the Columbia Basin. So we use those tools, and we're hoping to provide those tools and share those tools with other watersheds. So hopefully they can integrate those as well. And these also, we want to make sure that the data and information is comparable across the different geographies and regulatory agencies, etc. And that the funding needs to reflect all of this. So we need bigger pots of money. I think that Shaara made a really good kind of case for that, just how much money the Central Valley brings into the state and how much these crops that this water is growing generates. And then such a small fraction goes towards the fish that also rely on these environments and that help create the environments of being healthy. It needs to be long-term and stable funding. Always having to go after the funding, it really creates an awkward energy. And so we're trying to look for funding as opposed to actually solving these really big complex issues related to salmon recovery. The funding needs to be neutral so that there's, ideally it should be neutral. This is a little bit hard, right? But we don't want to have the optics of, oh, this is a, this agency project, or this one's backed by this project. And that was something that we came up with, that we bumped up a lot against. And, that's just a little bit difficult. And then it needs to be sufficient to support inclusivity, so that if an NGO or if a tribe doesn't have its own funding to send people to participate in these different big collaborative processes, that we can say, hey, we have the funding, please come to us, we can make this happen for y'all, we want your voices heard. So salmon recovery is possible in the Central Valley. This is huge, our models showed this, and this process showed it, and so this is really good news. Thank you, sorry for going a couple minutes over. I'm Natalie Stauffer-Olsen, here's my contact. And thank you to our funders, the Delta Science Program, State Water Contractors, NOAA, MET, and the Water Foundation. Those were our funders, thank you.
Thanks for being here. My name is Christine Davis with California Trout out of the North Coast office in Arcata, California. And I know several of you here today, but a lot of you I don't. So it's a huge privilege and joy to be able to share the work we're doing in the North Coast with a different audience. So I'm presenting this exciting work on behalf of my Cal Poly Humboldt co-authors, Farrah Tyler and James Graham. Farrah is a graduate student in the geospatial program at Cal Poly, and she's also presenting a poster on the methods for the modeling she did later tonight. So she'll be able to give more details on that too. But today I'm going to talk about a riparian climate refugia index for Northern California, and our case study is in the Eel River watershed. But first, I do want to share a little bit about myself and how I got to be here today. You'll notice this talk is not in the schedule, and that's because I had knee surgery 6 weeks ago, And I thought, there's no way I'm going to make it to SRF in time for, like, to heal in time. But it turns out I'm doing so it's very exciting. And Dana called me on Monday and said, "Can you present after all?" And I was like, okay. So I've been working on this for a couple days, and I hope it works out. Let's try. So, as I mentioned, I'm a project manager for California Trout, but I'm not a fish biologist. My background is in forest ecology, conservation biology, and large landscape level planning. I do work mostly with fish biologists. Our entire team for the Eel River program that I'm a project manager for are fish biologists and hydrologists. So I spent the first several years of my career working in the largest contiguous wilderness in California, which is Kings and Sequoia National Parks. So it was there that I realized I wanted to be part of making decisions or strategic decisions on protecting large landscapes or looking at ways to look at a whole watershed. But yeah, among many cool experiences working there, probably the coolest was watching a rattlesnake catch a trout from the riverbank. But what really happened was an understanding of the work that I needed to do after being a biological science technician, which is I understood how important large connected landscapes are for biodiversity and climate resilience, and so that led me to Cal Trout to integrate that piece of the work with what's happening in the stream for fish. So that's kind of my background. So some of you know California Trout is in preparation for the future Eel River Dam's decommissioning process with a lot of different project partners, different agencies. And right now we're in phase 2 of the Eel River Restoration and Conservation Program. And we're working on this with our consultant team of Applied River Sciences and McBain Associates and UC Berkeley. We're doing this on behalf of the Round Valley Indian tribes and the other people in the watershed. So the plan sets a large framework for restoration and conservation actions needed to improve salmonid habitat across the watershed. And the main focus of this plan or program is that in-stream habitat for our focal fish species, salmonids and other fish. But in phase 2 of this Eel River Watershed program, which we've just kicked off last month, we're implementing the prioritization of fish habitat for restoration and conservation. So that plan has a conservation component that is looking at potential strategic conservation areas around the river corridor, which is commonly referred to as the riparian area. So Cal Trout, North Coast, and Cal Poly Humboldt are partnering to develop this forthcoming riparian climate refugia data set for the whole Eel River watershed. So the model is scaled at 30 meters, and it's a climate refugia index of riparian habitat quality, which can be overlaid with the in-stream anadromous fish habitat work that our project team is doing, the fish biologists. So the future protection and restoration of the highest quality climate refugia areas and adjacent habitat may greatly support the landscape level climate resilience in the Eel River watershed and beyond. So this work I'm going to share with you today is just one piece of the strategic conservation analysis that will help local planners, tribes, and other groups identify important areas for prioritizing conservation and restoration actions, and thus support that stream-adjacent critical salmonid habitat. So, first of all, what is a landscape? It's such a broad term. What is landscape ecology? Well, a landscape scale is typically a watershed, but a watershed can be many different sizes. It can look like many different things. But I use spatial data at large scale or that landscape scale to strategize for habitat protection and look for ways to come to a common understanding, no matter what size that watershed is, and work to scale to find areas that are most in need of protection and restoration. I do this because strategically located and managed conservation areas can reverse habitats to impact loss. So here you can see the Eel River watershed where I work. I mean, look at the size of this thing. You can envision this, the boundaries of this go across 5 counties. If you took that shape in your head and you put it over the Bay Area or the greater Los Angeles area, it's bigger than those. So it's just a lot to work with. It has a topographically diverse system of 7 subbasins, all with different geologies that cause different impacts. And rivers in areas such as this often flow across elevational gradients and ecotypes and different habitats. So how do we strategize for good restoration and conservation solutions across such a vast area? Well, we can look closely at what is at risk and why, and come up with the best strategy we can make resilient conservation solutions. So not only does the eel have abundant habitats, but what I've learned from the fish biologists on our project team is that many anadromous fish use almost the entirety of the watershed to express their life history diversity needs. So this map generally shows different habitats used by steelhead over the course of their lifetime. Estuaries, cool perennial tributaries, inland main stems, coastal main stems, and seasonally dry tributaries for that winter habitat, for winter runs. And with this abundant habitat and huge area, there's really a need for coordination of restoration and conservation actions at a large scale. So that's what our program is doing, is trying to find the different crucial analysis that we can bring together to come to make good decisions. So the major impacts in the watershed are, let's see, this is actually a historic picture of a salmonid catch that happened all in one day historically. But the major impacts are non-sustainable resource extraction practices, historic flooding, which has altered food availability, the Potter Valley Dam complex, the invasive or predatory pike minnow, which is invasive in the eel, channel simplification, estuarine, and lower river levee construction. And then of course climate, drought, and warming, all of those compounding factors which increase the risk of fire, but not only fire, but intensity of fire. So what is riparian climate refugia? Very generally speaking, they're areas that provide food, water, and shelter for animals as the climate shifts. It's not a forever solution, but we believe it could be important in the near and midterm, like as in it could buy time, right? So Anderson et al. Said that species persisted under past climatic changes through this refugia combined with range shifts to track to suitable climates. And rapid warming projected for the next century will likely require many species to adapt in similar ways. However, high levels of habitat loss and fragmentation due to anthropogenic activities are actually isolating populations and creating barriers to species movement that were not present during past periods of rapid climate change. So things are changing, and we can't just go off the past, but we can learn from parts of the past and adjust based on what's really going on the ground. So a study done by Crosby et al. From the University of Washington, she runs the climate impacts group there. They looked at riparian climate refugia over the whole Pacific Northwest, and they use a mean annual temperature, canopy cover, riparian area width, potential relative solar radiation, and the landscape condition. They used those 5 data sets and produced an index of 30-meter squares across the whole Pacific Northwest, so at a very large scale, of 1 through 5 climate refugia around riparian areas. But first, before we dive into that, I want to ask, why do we want to focus on riparian areas, and especially climate resilient ones? What value do riparian forests have to fish habitat? Climate-resilient riparian areas buffer critical salmonid habitat. They improve water quality by filtering toxins, provide structural refuge for fish and other animals, and also protecting refugia is a strategic approach to help connect the surrounding landscape to those riparian corridors. And we do it this way because strategic inclusion of climate refugia into conservation and restoration planning can contribute to that landscape level resistant at a watershed level. So to protect remaining climate resilient areas in the watershed, strategic landscape level planning is needed to identify and include connected climate refugia networks in future protected area and restoration planning. And for the Eel River program, we're creating a resiliency strategy for the riparian corridor protection. And today our focus is on the riparian climate refugia index and using Crosby's methods for the Pacific Northwest, scaling that down to the watershed size of the Eel River, which, as I showed you before, is still a huge area, but we're refining the data sets that are appropriate for that size. And these are the three major analyses that are going into that conservation solution for the Eel River watershed. The connectivity corridor, the riparian climate refugia, and then a conservation analysis with Mark Sand that actually presented on last SRF in the dam session. So corridors are important because they help maintain that connectivity through the landscape. And connectivity is the most important aspect of conservation planning for biodiversity. So many healthy riparian areas actually provide that connected climate refugia naturally. The protection and restoration of those corridors is needed to support the resilient habitat linkages between water and upland areas outside of the riparian area. As most of you already know, the riparian areas facilitate the movement of plants and animals and provide refuge from stresses caused by climate change. And this is part of why we're working on this refugia for the Eel River watershed. So the complement that the riparian corridors bring to the existing protected areas create linkages which support that species movement. So these areas range in elevation from cool to warm areas, provide natural corridors that species could use to move as temperatures shift. These are the riparian climate corridors. There are also species that will need to shift laterally, and some even downward. About 20% estimated will be moving down, not up mountains. So we're not just looking at cold mountainous areas to protect, we're looking at the whole landscape. It's really important to do that. And so we do have this strategy for the conservation piece of the restoration and conservation program in the eel. And the steps are identifying the existing protected areas, so doing a spatial analysis across that whole watershed to look at the areas that are already protected, and then analyze the percent protected area across each of those subbasins, so we can actually have a representative sample to work with. And then we're recommending, mapping the existing and potential riparian corridors, and then recommending good options for future protected areas. So that would be areas that are buffering those existing protected areas and connected to other habitat, and overlaying this riparian climate refugia index to help inform climate resilient restoration and conservation planning. And that index basically looks like squares over the riparian area that have numbers from 1 to 5. And all of these conservation analysis pieces will be overlaid with the work that the fish biologists on the project team are doing to look at the in-stream habitat needs of salmonids and the other focal fish species. So that's important to remember. This is the terrestrial riparian study, and there's other things going on in-stream that are really vital to this research. Okay, so this is where we go into like, how do you actually make the riparian climate refugia? Well, we're developing the climate refugia index And Farrah Tyler is going to present a poster going deep into these methods, so I'm just going to glide over it. But this index will be used as a data overlay for the riparian corridor planning. This is the entire refugia data set that Crosby made for the watershed, or the whole Pacific Northwest. And we're downscaling their basic data inputs and adjusting them and updating them for the eel. So Crosby looked at riparian area, low solar radiation, daily average air temperature, density of vegetation, and landscape disturbance. The following slides outlined in blue here were made by our graduate student Farrah, who's working on the modeling. So her research objectives are to identify the environmental characteristics of climate-resilient riparian areas, model riparian climate refugia, or RCR, in the Eel River watershed at a 30-meter resolution. 30 meters is about the size of that door to that door, maybe a little bit less, so 30 by 30. And assess the distribution of that potential riparian climate refugia across the watershed for the connectivity planning that we're doing and habitat quality assessments. So just a little bit more about this. What the Crosby team did and what we're modeling it after is they modeled riparian climate corridors in the Pacific Northwest at a 270-meter resolution and a scaled index of potential refugia quality in the riparian corridor. And this is a closer look at the data that we are using for the eel. Here you have those 5 variables again, but these are at a 30-meter scale, so we're going into more detail that's appropriate for the size of the landscape we're working in. This is a flow chart of the modeling that Farrah has done, and these are the data inputs that I just showed you in that table, those 5. Note that the riparian climate refugia analysis includes potential riparian area, so that's the actual area around the rivers, and that's one of the pieces. Each of these 5 pieces has its own modeling and analysis that then goes into another network to create the index. So just pulling one of those out to highlight it, the riparian area workflow started with a 30-meter DEM, and then Farrah used the stream network analysis and looked at flow direction, stream channel network, and flow accumulation, and then did a cost distance analysis with the slope. And that produced this riparian area data set. And this kind of shows a cartoon of what that product came from. If you had to look at a river corridor and what did we actually map, this is what we tried to map. And here's a visual representation of those inputs and outputs. So you have the DEM, the slope, the stream network, and the potential riparian area is the outcome for the whole Eel River watershed. In the summer, we're going to spend some time going up into each of these major sub-watersheds and ground truthing that riparian area. So that'll be exciting to do some field work and get out there. And then we're also going to do some remote sensing analysis to look at the validation that's needed for that whole watershed data set. So for the expected results, we're expecting to see differing values for mountainous regions near headwaters and lowlands. So you might get more 5s in the mountainous areas and more 1s and 2s in the lowland areas. There's a correlation with high value corridors and existing protected areas. And we're going to have a sensitivity analysis and also an uncertainty analysis. So we can look at the data and see how certain are we about this at a 95% confidence interval level, etc. And then of course we'll be able to see some effects of local but severe movement barriers across the watershed. For example, if you had a 1 or a 2 in this habitat, you might say, wow, there's no climate resilient habitat there, we're not going to do anything. And that would be wrong, because those low numbers are also really informative and important. If we had 1s or 2s here, but really important in-stream fish habitat, or that stream is connected to a protected or well-managed forest, that's still really valuable. And maybe we can say, there's not refugia, terrestrial refugia right next to the stream that needs to be protected. Maybe it needs to be restored. And so to bring back that restoration element into, might inform more on the restoration side than the conservation side. So I would say all data in the riparian climate refugia index is good data. It's just what we do with it and how we make decisions based on the information it gives us. So in summary, for this conservation approach, we're identifying riparian corridors and potential protected area networks, modeling the ecological values across the watershed, identifying climate resilient habitat, and facilitating the protection of key areas, and adding information to our potential restoration actions across the watershed. And today we focused on this third one that's highlighted in green, identifying the climate resilient riparian habitat index from 1 to 5. And just to share kind of the big picture of how these tools and data are working together with other work our teams are doing. We have the restoration prioritization, which I showed you in phase 2 we kicked off last March. That is an analysis of the in-stream or channel archetypes, and we have more information on our program webpage about that. It's basically what fish need and where across the watershed, and that will be aggregated into the HUC 12 level. If you're not familiar with HUC 12s, think back on the hugeness of that Eel River watershed. There's about 124 smaller sub-watersheds that are at the HUC 12 size across the whole Eel River watershed. So that's the scale that we'll be creating a suite of restoration and conservation actions for across the watershed. And then we have the conservation prioritization, which is a much bigger data set of every parcel in the whole Eel River watershed. That's 78,000 parcels. So we used a different kind of planning software for that called MarkSan that could help us look at high quality habitat that's connected to conservation areas. And then we're also creating this riparian climate refugia index and hoping to publish that next year. So everything's really in process, but the program itself has been going since 2022. The work across the whole watershed has been going since at least before 2012 with community groups, agencies, tribes coming together and creating the vision and goals and approach and strategy for the Eel River program. So this is just a small piece of what we're doing, but it's a much bigger effort, and we're growing and learning how to expand that capacity with these tools across the watershed. You can explore some of the data that we've already started for the EEL program here. This is on CalTrout's website. It's the EEL program webpage. You can sign up for our newsletter, look at our data portal where we have an interactive map. You can also look at the plan that we wrote as a team in 2024. That's a picture of the cover of the plan. And you can email me, cdavis@caltrout, if you want to learn more or just connect or have ideas. I'm happy to hear from you. And these are some of my references. So, thanks a lot.
Awesome, thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Paige Gardner, and I'm a second-year PhD student at UC Santa Cruz. Today I'll be talking to you about the subject of my dissertation and my research so far, which is the rapid evolution of persistence of steelhead populations, specifically in California. So we know that the subject of this session today is that climate are thermally vulnerable, and that's becoming only exacerbated by climate change. The migrating life history exposes salmon naturally to a really wide range of both natural and modern stressors. And climate change, climate change is causing significant changes in precipitation and air temperature, such as decreased snowpack, increased variability in rainfall, these other anthropogenic stressors that are taking water away from systems, that are decreasing salmon access to cool, consistent water throughout those thermally most stressful times of the year, which are mostly those summer months. And just to reorient ourselves back to this life stage model, then the life stages that are at the highest risk of thermal vulnerability then are migrating and spawning salmon, as well as the eggs and juvenile life stages. So this is really concerning, and it's urging really a lot more research to understand how steelhead populations will respond to climate-induced warming. Briefly to discuss how temperature actually impacts fish. So I included this little figure here to show how rising temperature, moving left to right on that x-axis there, decreases the fish's ability to do some sort of physiological function. And this physiological function could be growth, survival, foraging, or completing just any basic bodily process. So as you can see, as the temperature increases, moving left to right, the physiological function, shown by that red line, gradually decreases over time until it eventually fails. So more specifically, rising temperature can cause increased metabolism and metabolic demand, decreasing energy stores and increasing need for food. It can also impair growth and development and cause increased disease risk. So we were seeing more and more alarming headlines that are really urging a need to fill data gaps. 2024 was the warmest year on record. Southern steelheads, we know around this time last year, were listed on the California Endangered Species Act, and then a 2025 study even found that 90% of steelhead subpopulations are at risk of becoming thermally stressed in the future. So this is really, we need to understand then, sorry about that, what pathways are available for survival, and how can we actually fill those data gaps. And steelhead make a really ideal study species in which to understand this problem. They're the most suddenly distributed salmonid, existing as far north as Alaska and as far south historically as Baja. So they naturally exist across a really wide range of thermal regimes. So by looking at those warmer streams, you can maybe understand what more northern and historically cooler streams might look like as we move into the future. So this creates a sort of natural experiment. Their large habitat range creates a natural thermal gradient that we can maybe utilize in thermal studies and genetic studies, which is what I propose to do here. So I just wanted to conclude a quick slide showing exactly how extreme those differences in temperatures can be. So that top big map there is Northern California, and the bottom map here is Southern California, and I pulled mean historic August temperatures from the Norwest temperature database. And so you can see that steelhead persists in all of these places, but in Northern California, the populations stay comfortably in those really blue, maybe a few green-colored streams, so well below 15 degrees Celsius, while in Southern California, fish continue to persist in streams where it's regularly getting above 20 degrees Celsius. You can also see this in a longitudinal range. So here's a map of the Russian River with that same stream temperature overlay. And near the mouth of the river, near Willow Creek in that range, the stream is really very cool. But if you move up into the headwaters of the Russian and the Ukiah Valley, the stream, there's still steelhead populations, but they're persisting in extremely warm and extremely different temperatures. So thermal tolerance is a really complicated trait in that many things can contribute to variation in thermal tolerance both within and between populations. Thermal regulation, just to kind of define some of the words here, thermal regulation is the ability of a fish or an organism to maintain its body temperatures needed for physiological success. And thermal tolerance is the range of temperatures at which a fish can do that. So you can kind of think of these three main pathways. So there'd be adaptation, behavioral, and plasticity. We've heard a little about behavioral thermal regulation in some of the previous studies, such as climate refugia and potential pathways for fish to find refuge from heat. So I'm actually not going to be discussing that in particular today. It is well understood that fish will spend time in thermal refuges when they are available. What I will be focusing on is what we understand a little bit less about, which is the adaptation and plastic components of thermal tolerance. And plasticity we're going to think of in terms of happening as reversible acclimation to some sort of environmental conditions over time at the individual scale, and adaptation is happening at the population level over space. So can steelhead keep up with the rate of climate change? And that seems to be a question we all want to know the answer to, and what we're all working towards here. So to kind of I'll be addressing three main questions under this umbrella here. So firstly, to address plasticity, how does the heating event then impact the thermal tolerance of a fish population and within that population? Next, to address adaptation, are populations from warmer streams better able to tolerate heat than those from cooler streams? at the larger population scale? And then can we then identify regions of the genome that might be associated with those differences in thermal tolerance? And the last part of this is taking what we learned from the physiological and genetic portions of the study to then inform conservation and management decisions. So to try to answer this question, we selected 3 different sites, kind of spanning the South Central DPS and also the Central Coast DPS. We went to Scott Creek up north, just 20 minutes or so from here in Santa Cruz, and also the Carmel Valley in Monterey, or Carmel River in Monterey County, and also Big Creek down in Big Sur. I'll be showing a few pictures from these locations just to brag a little bit about how beautiful the locations are that I get to do my field work. But here, so just these these figures here are just to show the historical temperature regimes that have existed in these streams. These are just the averages over the time series available. So Big Sur down at was our coolest stream, and it stays consistently cool throughout the summer months. Carmel Valley in summer months does get on average very warm, but it doesn't vary much around that mean, and the mean is shown by the black line. And then Scott Creek, our northernmost site, is very warm in summer months and has extreme daily fluctuations around the mean. So each of these sites, we collected 100 individuals using electrofishing, and these histograms here just shows the size distribution of the individuals that we sampled. We were targeting the young of the year to juvenile life stages, 0 to 1+. And we targeted all of these locations in the August-September time range. This study was designed to take place entirely in the field, so this allows us to test fish as close to their natural environment as possible. And there are 3 key steps to this protocol. We do a short-term acclimation before then doing experiments and then taking genetics and morphometrics measurements. So in the first step, we do a short-term acclimation. So of those 100 fish that I showed you in that histogram earlier, we actually break that 100 into 4 groups of 25. Each of those groups of 25 are then held in a short-term holding tank where they spend 20 hours before they're then exposed to their experiments. And each of those holding temperatures are designed to simulate some sort of acute exposure to a warming event. So those temperatures we selected then are ambient, so that's just the stream temperature, 20, 23, and 25 degrees Celsius. And again, this is the temperature that fish spent 20 hours at before they then were exposed to their temperatures. And here's a picture of what this looks like in the field. This takes a lot of fish care and lots of love goes into this step. We hold fish in that top container with the net over the top and some planks of plywood. So in that bottom tank there is where stream temperature or stream water is actually pumped in and then heated and pumped up into the tank with the fish in the top. So following that holding treatment, the fish are then exposed to critical thermal maximum experiments to quantify their upper thermal limits. This is a really great protocol to do because it allows us to do lots of fish at one time. And so we take a subset of the fish from that group of 25, maybe 7 or 8 at a time. We put them in a new container and we do that, then expose them to a heat ramp. So that heat ramp happens at a rate of 0.3 degrees Celsius per minute. We do this using a heating element. I'm happy to talk more about that later. And then the trial is then over for each individual fish once they lose equilibrium. So this is a temperature at which the fish is no longer able to stay upright in the water column and essentially passes out, sort of. This is a non-lethal experiment. As soon as the fish loses equilibrium, we scoop it out and then we allow it to recover following that experiment. And this is what it looks like in the field. You can see the stream there in the back, so this really is happening exactly stream side. And that cooler that you see the lid off, that's where we heat the water and where we do our critical thermal maximum experiments. And those black buckets in the back are where the fish are then allowed to cool down following these trials. And the last step is to actually correlate that trait with their genome. So we take a thin clip and we also take length and mass for every single fish that we measure. Importantly, we maintain individual level data throughout this process. I also wanted to give just a quick snapshot of the field work. We're very lucky in that we get to do a lot of this work outside, and a major strength of this experiment is that we are testing fish as close to their natural environment as possible. You can see our critical thermal maximum experiments. I think you can see even some fish there. There's some fish. You can see some fish in there. We also have some great volunteers without whom this research would not have been possible. There's me looking very scientific, downloading stream temperature data. And then there's one of our field sites in the Carmel River. So let's go ahead and dive into the results. So firstly, to address plasticity, I wanted to understand how exposure to an acute warming event, such as one fish might naturally experience, change the thermal tolerance within a population. So we hypothesized that increasing acclimation temperatures will increase their thermal tolerance and result in higher critical thermal maximum, or CT max, values. So just to orient ourselves quickly to this graph before I show you the rest of the results. On the x-axis is the treatment, so this is the temperature at which fish spent 20 hours at before they then underwent their trials. So their acclimation temperature is increasing, moving left to right on the x-axis. And then on the y-axis is their critical thermal maximum. And each of those large dots, these are, they're not super big on the screen here, but each of those large dots is the average for each population and each treatment. And each of the little dots is an individual. In pink is Big Sur, in green is Carmel, and then in blue is Scott Creek. So if our hypothesis is correct, we'll expect to see some sort of increase in thermal tolerance as acclimation temperature increases. If our hypothesis is incorrect, we won't see any changes. But our hypothesis was correct. So as holding temperature increased, so did the temperatures that the fish could tolerate. We do expect to see this based off of previous research that's been done in the field on red band and steelhead and even some cutthroat trout. And this plasticity is well reported. So fish can acclimate to their environment. They alter their proteins and gene expression to compensate for additional heat. We can look at this figure even further, so we can kind of create some sort of reaction norms. So I wanted to show that just by connecting each of these average values. So again, these big dots are the average CT max for each location and each treatment. And what I really want you to take away from this figure here is that they all converge on the same point once they reach that 25 degrees Celsius acclimation treatment. So it seems that there is still some, while plasticity might be an important mechanism of thermal tolerance, there's still some sort of upper limit that might be important to consider as we think about the climate change effects on populations. So in conclusion then, thermal tolerance is impacted by environmental temperatures and has some amount of plasticity, but there is a certain thermal threshold or limit at which fish are then maxed out. So next, I want to understand the role of adaptation. Are populations from warmer streams better able to tolerate higher temperatures than those from cooler streams? And can we correlate those differences with differences in the genome? This is an ongoing area of study, and I'm really excited to see what we might learn as we move into our next field season. So I'm going to be presenting what we've learned so far, our hypotheses, and sort of our next steps. So if we hypothesize that steelhead populations from warmer streams, such as the ones I showed you in Southern California, we might hypothesize that those warmer populations have higher thermal tolerance than those from cooler streams. So we would expect to see, for like just some sort of conceptual figure here to help envision that a hot source environment individual might perform better at warm temperatures, while a cold source environment individual might perform better at cooler temperatures. So looking back at the same figure, we can begin to tease apart differences in thermal tolerance between populations. So looking at those middle two treatments there, the 20 and 23 degrees Celsius acclimations, Scott Creek does have statistically significant higher thermal tolerance than the other two populations. So this is starting to be really interesting. And again, just to reorient ourselves to those thermal regimes in each of these locations, Scott Creek during those summer months is warm and extremely variable in its temperatures, while Carmel is warm and constantly so, and Big Sur is cool but stays constantly cool throughout those summer months. While differences in the mean between populations is really interesting, and this is really exciting, it might mean that Scott Creek may be thermally adapted to warmer temperatures. We can actually zoom in here on treatment 3 and think about variation around the mean, think about population level responses. So at Scott Creek, where the temperature is warm and variable, almost all individuals had the exact same thermal tolerance. So this means that, I'm going to just back up a little bit, so that also in Carmel there in green, where the temperature is warm but constantly so, there's a really wide range of responses between individuals. This is almost just to kind of orient ourselves here, some individuals had thermal tolerance as low as 30 degrees Celsius, while others had it as high as 32.5 degrees C. So this variation around the mean is extremely interesting, and biologically we can say that maybe Scott Creek had nearly the same physiological response to warming, and a warm environment with extreme daily fluctuations in temperature, it may be beneficial to have highly plastic thermal tolerance traits. So in conclusion then, inter and intra-population variation in thermal tolerance does potentially suggest evidence for local adaptation. Another future direction might be that We can understand plasticity itself as an adaptive trait and potential mechanism for persistence. And so the next steps then, as we start to think about genotyping, is we can try to correlate variation in the genome or variation in the trait that we measured, the upper thermal limit, with variation in the genome. So what we can do is do a genome-wide association study, and again, this is the same distribution graph that I showed you earlier, and we can pick the top 10% most thermally tolerant and the top 10% least thermally tolerant from each population, and compare their genomes and look for genetic outliers that might be associated with thermal tolerance. In this figure here, we might produce some sort of a Manhattan plot, looking something like this one here from a study from Chen et al. 2018 that did a very similar thing with red band trout. And all of those colored dots there are potential genetic outliers that might be associated with thermal tolerance in red band. And so we can also leverage previous studies and work together collaboratively, like we're all seeing through SRF here, to hopefully develop some sort of knowledge of what there might be for local adaptation to warming. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this slide, but we're working on developing this data set even further and selecting new field sites that will maximize both the physiological and genetic output of the study. So just briefly, I'll say that we'll be utilizing some genetic studies done by our collaborators, Carlos Garza, to pick populations within this circle that you see here, and also pick populations for within watershed comparisons to try to tease apart even further evidence for local adaptation. I'd be happy to talk more about this later in the Q&A. So then the last question is, how can we apply what we learned in these first two steps to management? And ultimately, we want to ensure that the results of the study can help inform conservation decisions. This portion of the study is still ongoing and will come in later steps. All this research is being supported through the Coastal Science and Policy Program of NOAA, and I'm in a unique position to interface with managers and to hopefully use this knowledge to help inform conservation decisions. So a major issue that we're seeing with climate change, just a quick conceptual diagram, is that the environmental conditions to which fish and fish populations are adapted to are becoming misaligned and becoming mismatched. So thinking about conservation decisions, we can either pick helping thermally vulnerable populations by bringing the environment conditions they need to them. So thinking about stream restoration strategies, or we can think about genetic restoration strategies. So how can we bring the phenotype to the environment? So first, to think about tracking that phenotype and bringing environment to the phenotype, we can think of different methods that we could potentially preserve cold water and populations that we can identify as being really thermally vulnerable and not likely to adapt to the next century of climate change. This could look like inserting large woody debris, which is something that has been a recurring theme at SRF. So such as building like a log jam structure here, or just simply inserting more logs and roughening up streams. We can also prioritize keeping water in waterways during the hottest times of the year for our most at-risk and again, most thermally vulnerable populations. Another major goal, and potentially the most challenging conservation strategy, is genetic rescue. So we really hope that we can use these tools to identify both genetically vulnerable and genetically valuable populations. So kind of orienting to this diagram here, if you start with a really cold stream, or population in a really cold stream that is well adapted to those cold conditions, but some sort of environmental change occurs, such as climate change, that population might then start to decrease, and we see populations start to drop off. We can take a population that we've identified as thermally strong and maybe has the genes that are associated with really high thermal tolerance and introduce those genes into that struggling population and potentially help bring that population back from the brink of extirpation. And this is maybe a very, hopefully this might be a little ambitious, but it's something that we should definitely be thinking about as we continue to push forward new conservation strategies. So just to quickly summarize all the things I've talked about today, thermal tolerance is highly plastic, but there does appear to be some sort of upper thermal limit to plasticity, but this may be a really important potential short-term mechanism of persistence. Lastly, next critical thermal maximum somewhat does vary between populations, but within population variation is definitely an important mechanism for understanding genetic variation within those traits. And then lastly, we hope to develop tools that can inform managers and help make the best decisions we can. And with that, I just want to say thank you to all my amazing collaborators and volunteers who helped make this happen. And yeah, thank you to everyone for listening.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Sorry, this is really loud. I love being at SRF, talking, fish with friends. It's always a good time. And so my name is Rachel Ryan. I'm a postdoc at UC Davis, and I'm going to present some of the dissertation work I did at UC Berkeley that was really kind of looking at resilience through the lens of kind of these spawning traits in an endangered coho population. And this is some work that I did with my co-authors, Rachel Johnson, Ted Grantham, and Stauffer-Olsen. So we're in a climate change seminar. I don't really need to go too much into how climate change is altering all of our watersheds, but I really want to kind of focus on the hydrological variability and volatility that we're seeing. And so if we think of this as kind of a typical coastal rain-fed hydrograph in the fall, kind of winter period, we have data along the x-axis and discharge on the y-axis. And so we might expect something like this, but with climate change, we're kind of seeing these shorter, sharper winter seasons that might be leading to increased flooding. We're seeing these really, really dry winter seasons where we might get really delayed flow pulses, if any at all. That can lead to kind of this earlier disconnection of streams. And we also are seeing kind of this higher variability, where the cues that native fish are relying on are kind of getting disrupted. And so fish might not have the right cues to outmigrate or to move up in spawning. And so I'm really focusing today on kind of that hydrological volatility. And of course that is compounded by all of the other things we've done in these watersheds. We've reduced our watersheds down in many ways so that we have kind of now this restricted mosaic. And so what that means is that instead of having kind of a large landscape of habitats that fish can kind of go into and seek refuge under these different climate events, we've really restricted them and we've reduced that mosaic. However, again, you're in this climate change seminar, and I think when we talk about collaboration, which is kind of the theme of this seminar right now, I think it kind of starts with stories and people sharing stories and experiences that get them engaged and motivated in the work. And so I just wanted to kind of take a pause and instead of just talking about climate change on a graph, hear from you. And so I'll just share a moment that kind of, for me, was, wow, this is really intense and actually kind of sad. Was working in summer 2021 in a beautiful tributary that usually is really nice habitat for salmon. And unfortunately, the only spawning was really high up in the tributary where by April, I was watching as these pools with tiny little fry chock-a-block with nowhere to go. They were drying up, and eventually I saw them fully dry. And this is an endangered species. It was really hard to watch, and it felt very impactful. And so I was wondering if anyone would like to share just a really brief moment of something that maybe hit you in your own work. Yes.
It's a little bit similar that I remember seeing a pond recently outside of that there were like coho, steelhead, there's a western pond turtle, and there were frogs, all in this like small pond right underneath this root log, and I was just like, please don't dry up, like please don't dry up, yeah.
Right, yeah, it's like you see it, oh no, and you're just so sad about it. Yeah, does anyone else have a story or a moment? Yes.
I had a project in Alameda Creek watershed where it was completed and we had drought. It wasn't really possible to test the hydraulics of this new project, and then the next winter when there was finally enough water to test it, there was so much it got buried in sand.
Oh. Heartbreaking, yes. And so I really appreciate you guys sharing, and I'm sure we all have some of those experiences that have really
led us to kind of be even more motivated in our work towards trying to build resilience in these systems. But I also want to kind of talk about some glimmers of hope. So in that same year, when I was just happened to be snorkeling further down in the tributary, and what I found was there were no young of the year, but we had some year-plus coho that had not been able to get out, but were surviving in these kind of deeper, cooler, oxygenated pools. And those fish persisted throughout the summer, hopefully went out in the fall, and I feel like that was kind of this really nice hope spot for me of how these diverse strategies can actually, you know, build resilience and fight against that kind of extreme climate events. And there's so many people who are in this room and they're at this conference whose work have kind of showed this. And so, for example, the work out of my old lab at UC Berkeley, a lot of work on non-natal rearing and how non-natal rearers, Hank Baker just did a really great paper and talked more about that, where they can really contribute to the adult population. A lot of work in Humboldt as well, showing about how these kind of non-natal strategies. There's work from my current lab at UC Davis, Anna Sturck, showing how fry migrants are really actually the piece in the puzzle, as well as work from Flora Cordigliani in UC Davis about these UC Santa Cruz about the yearling holdovers that during drought actually helped a cohort escape extirpation. As well as when access to floodplain is available and fish are using the floodplain, they come back more than others. And so I just want to say that all of those are diverse strategies that really give me hope for building resilience in these watersheds. And one of the ways that can happen is when we have these connected, diverse habitats, so this habitat mosaic. And when some parts of these watersheds, so for example, we might have a main stem, we might have a forested tributary, we might have an intermittent stream, and they all have different pressures. We might have some different growth trajectories, some dispersal opportunities, and some phenological variation. And in some years, they'll do better than others. Some habitats will do better than others, and will come back as adults and supplement other areas of the watershed. And in some years, some parts of those habitats might not be successful at all. And that is where this dispersal part, this connection part, is really important. We have potentially some of these sink patches and then some source patches. And dispersal allows fish to recolonize those sink patches so that we can again expand the habitat mosaic. And that's why I like looking at spawners, because that spawner dispersal is really key to that recolonization, that is building resilience in the metapopulation. So if you have a sink habitat, you can have some recolonization that is then reactivating that habitat mosaic and re-expanding it for the next generation of juveniles. And then timing. It's not just where the fish are going, but when are they going there. And so the spawn timing and the diversity of spawn timing is really important for risk spreading, for example, avoiding the single scouring event or dewatering, for the emergence of fry and the timing of that emergence with high growth opportunities, as well as dispersal opportunities. That's why I think that looking at spawning and these spawning traits is really important to try and understand resilience in a system, especially when we have kind of these this climate volatility and extreme climate events. And so I looked at these traits in one of the most beautiful watersheds out there, which is Lagunitas Creek. It is just north of San Francisco in this small watershed, so 270 kilometers squared, and it is a stronghold for critically endangered coastal coho salmon. All right, jumping ahead. And half of the watershed is inaccessible due to dams. However, it maintains some pretty good habitat diversity. So we still maintain some of these habitat mosaics I'm talking about. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to simplify it. We really are only going to focus on this main stem. I don't know which one to look at. This main stem, Lagunitas, and its tributaries will be considered one basin. And then our major tributary on the left here, Olema Creek, is going to be the other basin. And we actually have an intermittent stream coming off of that tributary as well. So those will kind of be our focus for this talk. And this watershed is really unique and allows us to explore these traits, but also use some really cool tools. So I'm going to kind of focus on a trait and also a tool. So first of all, there is a fault line that is running right through the watershed, and that leads to having this geologic diversity, and the underlying geology is very diverse, but it also means the stream chemistry is very diverse. And that allows us to track dispersal using otoliths, which are fish ear stones. And they are calcium carbonate structures that incorporate the stream water chemistry where the fish are. And so they kind of leave this like fingerprint of where the fish are in fresh water. And they can help us kind of tell a story of where fish have been in their freshwater lifetime. The other great thing about this watershed is that it has variation in flow regimes. So as I mentioned, it is dammed, and so this main stem, Lagunitas Creek, is dammed and flow regulated. And then we have this smaller Olema Creek, which is unregulated. And there are differences in size. So Lagunitas Creek is in the winter about 3 times the flow of Olema Creek, so just throwing it out there, these size differences, as well as kind of these flow regulation differences. But that lets us kind of look at how timing differs between these basins and how flow regulation potentially can alter relationships to flow and timing. And so I'm looking at kind of these 2 different traits across time. So with the otolith and dispersal, we're looking from 2010 to 2019, which is encompassing that major drought, multi-year drought, 2012-2016 period. And then for the timing, I'm really honing in on kind of the start timing, so when do fish first come up in the watershed, and then the peak, when do the majority of fish come to start spawning. And we have data from that from 2005 to 2022, so also encompassing a wide range of environmental variation. But again, in the spirit of this being a collaborative session, I would be remiss to not say this is a highly collaborative effort. So I want to kind of shout out everyone right now. So all of the field data, so much field data, walking the creeks, tracking reds, getting otoliths from carcasses, which can be nasty work, was all done by Marin Water. Eric is in the room, a lot of his work, and his WS piece right here as well. And National Park Service, they have done all of the field work in this project. I had a lot of help doing dissections from some high schoolers, and also Elena is also in the room. And then UC Davis really helped with all of the otolith work, Rachel Johnson's lab, the otolith queen of the Central Valley. So I really got a lot of help and guidance from them, and this was all funded by California Sea Grant. So a small collaboration compared to a lot of the stuff that's been talked about today, but I wanted to make sure that all of those efforts were recognized in the data that you're about to see. So as I mentioned, we have kind of these streams that have a geological fingerprint. And when we look at the otolith, which, and this is a polished otolith, we have kind of the core, and you have daily growth rings. So it kind of looks like a tree ring, right? And so as they grow, we have kind of daily rings that are incorporating that stream chemistry, and we can kind of look at that natal period and kind of look at their fingerprint. And from there, we can assign spawners that have returned to a certain stream their natal origin. We can see whether they came back or whether they moved around. And a few conclusions from this work that I thought were kind of interesting is that Lagunitas subbasin, it is much larger, about 4 times larger than the Olema subbasin, and made up 63% of the otoliths recovered were returned to Lagunitas, but actually 70% of the fish had been born in Lagunitas. And so they are kind of more of this source population for the larger meta-population. I'll kind of show a diagram that kind of helps us figure out what that means. Also, in almost all years, Lagunitas fish were going into Olema Basin and supplementing, so that dispersal into the other basin was quite strong. And we actually didn't see a lot of dispersal from out of the watershed. And I did do kind of some fingerprinting of streams all up and down the coast. It can be more extensive, and I think this is the place where collaboration can be even greater, is if we're really trying to understand dynamics across the range. We would need a much larger effort on trying to characterize the geology. But for now, we saw some unknown fish that came in, but they represent a small proportion. So one of the things that really came out of this work that was really cool, though, is the habitats that are really important. And so this intermittent stream, this green one here, like I said, it's quite small. It's in this Lima basin. It actually has an outsized contribution to adults in some years. So for example, in the brood year of 2010, we had 23% of all of the reds in the basin were from this intermittent stream, yet 60% of the returns were from that stream. And so clearly it's having an outsized impact from that brood year, which is really exciting, right? What's more is even in a drought year, in 2015, which was a drought year, we still saw these intermittent stream reared fish having quite a large impact. And so they were 50% of the reds, but also 50% of the return, 2-year-old returns. And so they're playing a large role in contributing to the overall population. We'll also notice is that in some years, we actually had complete, no otoliths that we were collected were found to be from the Lima Basin. And that was following a really extreme drought year in 2014. And so we found in Lagunitas, we had Lagunitas fish coming back. In Lima, we had some Lagunitas fish and some unknown origin fish coming back. And then we had some Lima jacks. So these, they only spent 1 year in the ocean, so they weren't from the cohort 3 years ago. So what this means is that that drought had a really severe impact on juveniles, potentially decimating that subbasin population, yet dispersal from our nearby source population and also through age structure was actually able to kind of recolonize that really critical habitat and re-expand that habitat mosaic for the next generation. So I think that's kind of like a hopeful part of this, is uncovering kind of those dynamics. And so what we learned from this is that the dispersal is really key, especially after extreme drought, for recolonizing habitats and maintaining metapopulation resilience. And that otoliths are this really interesting tool for uncovering those dynamics that maybe we don't see if we just count the fish, right? And so it kind of is allowing the fish to really tell their story of where they've been. So that is kind of method or tool number 1 that I wanted to share. Tool number 2 is looking at discharge and the different kind of discharge metrics between an unregulated stream and a regulated stream. So for example, we go back to our hunter graph, and when spawners are coming up in the winter, they're really waiting for some of these cues. This winter precipitation is creating these cues for them to move up. So for example, the timing of flow elevation, the magnitude of flow, and the variability in flow are all important for spawners to have that cue to move in. When we have flow regulation, such as in Lagunitas, we actually have kind of an artificial raising of the base flow for salmon, to attract salmon, which might make it earlier and decoupled from precipitation. And we might have some decreased variability and increased or decreased magnitude. And so as we can go back to our basins here, we might expect that these differences in flow regulation can lead to differences in spawner relationships to flow and also phenology. So I'm going to try and breeze through this pretty quickly. But basically the differences in onset, so the differences in the timing, first we look at differences in timing, the start timing of spawning. And these are kind of a null hypothesis, would just be both the stream populations are responding in the same way, where later wet season start leads to a later spawn timing, and more flow variability would lead to later spawn timing. differences in the peak flow day, also driven by the day of peak flow, and as we have more flow, we would actually see earlier spawning. So these are our hypotheses. We tested these using generalized linear models, but I'm just going to kind of show, first of all, just with the data, what these spawning distributions look like. I think they're pretty interesting. So on the x-axis here, we just have kind of the date, and on the y-axis, we have all of our different years that we looked at spawn timing. And I'll just kind of point out, the onset times were very different. So Lagunitas Creek was pretty consistent every year, whereas Lima Creek was later and sometimes very variable. We also had similarities in the peak. So the peak spawn timing was actually conserved pretty much across all years. So that start time might be different, but when all of the spawners are coming out, it's pretty much the same. And when we look into kind of the drought year, this is really important because we see, even in these really extreme drought years, so look at 2012 and 2014, where we had really delayed onset of winter rains and really high variability. That spawn timing in the Lima Creek is really late. And these are actually, 2014 was that cohort, or sorry, 2012 was that cohort that we saw didn't have any otoliths recovered from the Lima Basin. And so that spawn timing potentially could have some downstream consequences. However, in Lagunitas, we see how that spawn timing is still consistent. And so we're maintaining a wide diversity and range of spawn timing, even in a really intense drought year. And so when we dug into kind of the relationships with flow, what we found was actually that the wet season start and flow variability had no impact on the spawn timing of Lagunitas, which that flow regulation is potentially dampening. However, they did have a really large impact in delaying spawn timing in the Lima. However, for peak spawning, as we said, those were conserved and those relationships are pretty similar across the basins. So I'll wrap up here by kind of just giving you the final takeaways. So in our spawn timing diversity, we saw how this actually, the variation in flow cues can actually help enhance resilience to drought by maintaining that spawn timing diversity and that start time, and how flow regulation or environmental flows could potentially be used as a tool to buffer against impacts of drought. And I want to make major caveats on that because Lagunitas Creek is a larger system. It is hard to kind of disentangle whether it's this flow regulation or it being a larger river, what really is driving it. But I think there's some pretty convincing evidence that that elevated flow early on is helping to bring in spawners at an earlier time. And so the keys here are that connected mosaic of habitats. Again, we've heard this over and over again today, but they really can provide resilience in these endangered populations. As long as we still have those connected ways for fish to disperse, we can have these recolonizing events, and we can kind of maintain a wide diversity of traits. And we can leverage these tools like otolith to read salmon stories and see what they're doing, as well as we can leverage potentially some of our flow regulation tools to buffer against precipitation variability. And so thank you again to everyone who's helped me in this effort, especially kind of my advisors, Stephanie and Ted. And I would love to chat with anyone afterwards about your other salmon stories and your climate change stories, because I think that's what we're all here connecting about. So thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Kelly Dassbinder. I'm a postdoc at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I work on building ecosystem modeling frameworks to look at the early life history of salmon, but as opposed to the talks that we've heard so far today, I look at them in the moment that they hit the ocean. And so we're going to be talking about some modeling for juvenile smolt survival and growth, and the impact that climate change are going to have on those. I want to point out that this is a big collaborative project between UC Santa Cruz and the Southwest Fisheries Science Center, and so I'm not the only person working on this. We've got a ton of other co-authors on this talk, and this has been the culmination of years and years of work to build these models. And so you've already seen a version of this figure in a few of the other talks in this session, but the life cycle of Chinook salmon. So they begin their lives in freshwater, then they move out into the ocean as juveniles, spend some time in the ocean, and then come back into freshwater to spawn. And the portion of the life cycle that I'm going to be talking about modeling today is this moment of ocean entry. So this is the moment when salmon hit the ocean through the end of their first few months at sea. And in order to address this, if we want to look at how this system is going to react to changes in climate, we've built a collaborative modeling framework to look at the impacts of changes in temperature and food availability on the growth potential of these juvenile salmon. And so this is a collaborative modeling framework that contains multiple different models that we use to drive each other, so there are modeling connections between them. And then ultimately, where I come in is that looking at the bioenergetics, so the growth potential of these juveniles. So the first piece of the puzzle you need if you want to look at climate impacts on anything is you need predictions about climate, right? And so if we want to see how temperature and food availability are going to change the way that salmon grow and survive in the ocean, we need to know how temperature and food availability are going to change. And so the first piece of this collaborative framework is Earth system models. So these are global scale climate models that predict temperature at a large scale under different emission scenarios. And we've done our modeling endeavor under the RCP 8.5 high emission scenario. And what that means is that this assumes that as a planet, we're not going to be lowering our emissions significantly in the next 100 years. This assumes that those emissions are going to continue to be high, and what we are looking at is what's going to happen if that is the case. These Earth system models were downscaled by a team that was led by Mayor, and what downscaling means is that you're taking these global Earth system models and you're using them to make calculations and project what's going to happen in your region. And so these Earth system models were downscaled to the California current region, and if you're interested in reading about how that was done, I've put the title of the paper up here. I'm not going to go into it today, but if you're interested, I invite you to look at that. And within the RCP 8.5 high emission scenario, we chose 3 different Earth system models to assess in an ensemble model. And we chose these 3 Earth system models because one of them, the Hadley model, represents a higher rate of warming within this emission scenario. The IPSL model represents a more moderate warming rate, and the GFDL model represents a low warming rate. And so that means that we're able to assess in this high emission scenario, maybe it has impacts of higher warming or lower warming within that scenario. We're able to assess an ensemble model and get some level of spread around that ensemble so that we can assess uncertainty. So what if it doesn't behave exactly like one of these Earth system models? We can ensemble those 3 Earth system models together to determine some level of uncertainty around this climate projection. The second part of the framework is the ecosystem modeling framework that I work on here at UCSC. This is a framework that ultimately drives a juvenile salmon growth model that we call the IBM. It's an individual-based model, which means it follows individual fish or packets of fish around in the modeling domain. And this is driven by a hydrodynamic and lower trophic level modeling partnership. And these are the models that drive the physical and nutrient cycling and chemical reactions that are happening in the water. So the model that we use for our ocean circulation model is ROMS. ROMS stands for the Regional Ocean Modeling System. And ROMS is a good candidate for modeling juvenile salmon because the projections that we have in this region, we have a high resolution domain at 1/30th of a degree, or about 3 kilometers, nested inside a lower resolution domain that has a resolution of about 10 kilometers. So that means that way offshore in the deep ocean, we are resolving physical processes like currents, eddies, and those type of physical oceanographic processes at a lower resolution. But as you get closer to shore, we're able to have higher resolution predictions of those processes. And this is important because where do juvenile salmon enter the ocean? At the shoreline, right? At the coast. And so a model that has high resolution near the coast means it's going to be capturing those physical oceanographic processes that those juvenile salmon are encountering upon ocean entry. The second part of our two driving models is a lower trophic level model. And what this means is that this model represents the base of the food chain. The model that we use for our lower trophic level model is called NEMU-CSC. It's a customized version of NEMRO, which is a pretty commonly used lower trophic level model along the West Coast. It predicts biogeochemical cycling, nutrient cycling, and things like phytoplankton and zooplankton groups. So this is the basis of productivity in our region. And what makes NEMU-CSC a good candidate for use in looking at juvenile salmon growth potential is that NEMRO has a large predatory zooplankton group, but NEMU-CSC takes that big zooplankton group and reparameterizes it to represent krill. Krill in the first few months at sea are good predictors of prey concentration availability for juvenile salmon. And so that makes NEMU-CSC a good candidate model for an ecosystem modeling framework specifically targeted towards answering questions about Chinook salmon, because you've got the physics that are in the domain that you need, and you've got the food. And so with those two pieces, physics and food, we can drive our growth model. And I want to really stress that I think sometimes these big numerical modeling endeavors can seem like it's a handful of people sitting at a computer writing code. But these models are validated and built on huge data sets of environmental variables and validated on these variables as well. And so this is a very collaborative process, right? So our physics model has mooring data, it has satellite data, you can use shipboard surveys, we can deploy instruments overside those surveys to measure things like temperature and salinity, and all of those data sets can be used to validate these models. And so if you want to check if your model is performing in a way that's realistic, you need actual empirical on-site data to check that out. Another thing that we can do is that we can also look at things like krill concentration. This is a few of us out on the rockfish survey through the Southwest Fisheries Science Center, sorting through piles of krill. If we want to be able to validate and build models that predict krill concentration, we want to be able to check how much krill is there. And so I just want to point out that this modeling endeavor represents a bunch of different groups. There's physical oceanographers at the university, there's the fisheries collaborative program between UCSC and NOAA, there's NOAA scientists that are out on shipboard surveys, and there's salmon ecologists that lend their expertise on the biophysical portions and what's going on within salmon bodies and salmon ecology. And so all of that culminates in the last piece of the puzzle, which is what I want to talk to you about today, which is the juvenile salmon bioenergetic model. And this is driven from temperature, from our physical model, krill fields from our lower trophic level model, and both of those things allow us to calculate fish bioenergetics and look at the potential for juvenile salmon to grow during their first few months at sea. And I'm not going to go into how we parameterize this model, but if you want to read about it, there are 2 papers that I've linked at the bottom of the slide if you want to look at some of that code for yourself and read some of those parameterizations. But the basics of it is that in order to look at salmon growth, you need a biomass assimilation value and a maintenance cost. And so that means that the biomass assimilation is how well you're able to take the food you're eating and turn it into body material. The maintenance metabolism is how much it costs you to keep that body, and then presumably you're going to do some behaviors with the body that you have now built and maintained, like swimming and following prey, and so then you also have a cost for those activities. And how climate change impacts juvenile salmon growth in the future is going to be reliant in part on a trade-off between these different things. So you're going to need to be able to assimilate biomass and keep up with the maintenance costs that it costs you to maintain that biomass. And I just want to illustrate this with a really simple example of we've plugged some values into our bioenergetic model and held the other variables constant. And so on the left, you're going to have increased krill concentration, so more food available to you, no increased temperature, temperature stays the same. On the right, you're going to have food held constant and temperature increasing. And so this means that we can look at what some of those trade-offs are going to be as we move into the future. And on the left, you can see that biomass assimilation increases as you increase the amount of food available by quite a lot, and that makes sense. If you have more food available to eat and you can eat that food, you can build your body material faster and better. Temperature also increases biomass assimilation, but by a smaller amount, and this is because as your metabolism speeds up, you're able to accumulate that body mass faster. If we then look at the maintenance costs, which remember are going to be subtracted from that biomass assimilation, we see that if you're increasing the food availability but leaving temperature the same, you're actually going to see a constant maintenance metabolism. And that's because in our model, regardless of how much food is available to you, the food that you actually ate is going to cost you the same amount to keep up. However, as temperature increases, this maintenance metabolism is going to increase dramatically because as you heat up the water, it speeds up your metabolism. And so this second term, the term that's being subtracted, is going to grow and grow as temperature increases. And so growth potential of juvenile salmon in the future is going to in part depend on the rates at which those metabolic needs outpace your assimilation of body mass abilities. And I just want to sidebar real quick into why does it matter? Like, why does it matter how quickly you grow in your first few months at sea? Are you going to make it out to the ocean and survive regardless of if you grow quickly or slowly? And the answer is maybe not. And that's because, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, when you enter the ocean as a baby salmon, you are immediately encountering a slew of potential predators. And if you look at our San Francisco Bay release areas, they actually come out right under the Golden Gate into the Gulf of the Farallones, and you're immediately kind of met with this group of bird rookeries. And they also have some level of timing overlap with these birds. So you are entering the ocean as a juvenile salmon. The birds have just had their chicks, they're hunting for chicks, they're hunting things that are about the size of a juvenile salmon. And so you have just entered this onslaught of potential predation. And on the left side here are some potential gapes for salmon predators. These are probability density functions of just like the highest number of fish of those size that were eaten. And then on the right is a growth curve for juvenile salmon predicted from our bioenergetic model. And if you overlay the gapes with the growth curve, you can see that you are going to have to do a lot of growing to get out of the gape ranges for all of those predators. And you can also see that if you're looking at the solid black line, which is the mean, as opposed to, it's not super clear on the screen, but you've got a range envelope in light gray there, that if you are growing and you are one of the faster growing juveniles, you can escape some of these gapes a full month before some of the slower growing juveniles. And that's important because if you're out in the ocean and you're being exposed to these predators, an extra entire month of exposure to predation vulnerability can make a big difference in whether or not you get eaten. On the other hand, if you're able to grow quickly, get out of those gape ranges, maybe you have a better chance of being safe. And so I'm not going to talk a lot more about predation today, but I just wanted to say that this is one reason why it matters how fast you grow. And so for our discussion today, I'm going to zoom in on a small portion of the California coast and look at how we've implemented this modeling system in our area. I'm going to be talking primarily about the region that encompasses both the Klamath River exit and the San Francisco Bay River exit. And if you use that modeling framework to calculate your trend in temperature, krill, and growth potential, you get the plots that you see on the left. And I'm going to be presenting results for May in this slide, but we can do them for the full upwelling season. In this temperature plot, you can see that yellow and orange values represent higher temperatures, blue and purple represent lower increases in temperature. And this is the trend over the full 100 years from 2000 to 2100. In the middle slide, this is your trend in krill concentration. So dark pink is going to be areas where the krill is able to also increase, and light pink is going to be areas where your krill concentrations show a negative trend by the end of the century. So you have less available prey in those areas. And what you'll see, if you look at that compared to our final plot, which is growth potential for juvenile salmon, is that areas of negative growth potential trends, so these dark purpley areas, are areas where you're increasing temperature, but you have decreasing krill. And so your metabolism is speeding up at a rate that the amount of food available in the water is not able to keep up with. On the other hand, in some areas, like for example, the north of California, there is still an increase in temperature, right? You still have a positive trend in temperature by the end of the century, but you also have a positive trend in krill. So the krill concentration also goes up in those areas, and then you get positive juvenile salmon growth potential. So if the amount of prey available in the water column is enough to sustain that increased speed of metabolism, you're actually able to grow faster and maybe better by the end of the century in those areas. And so what we've done, and the way the rest of the slides are going to be laid out, is that we've isolated two interesting areas where salmon release, the Klamath and the San Francisco Bay. And we've looked at what would happen if you were to enter those areas earlier than expected or later than expected. And so if you enter the ocean from the Klamath River system earlier than expected or later than expected, our ensemble trend is going to be positive either way. And you can also see that these error bars represent the spread between those three Earth system models. So regardless of whether you take a more conservative or more extreme approach to warming, you still see positive overall growth potential trend. However, if you look at southern regions of our area, especially south of San Francisco Bay, you can see that there is a negative growth potential, which means that growth is higher now than it is in the future. Over the course of the century, that growth is going to be decreasing. And one area that I want to call special attention to is the area right around 37.5 degrees. You can see that there are some bars where the error bars span the zero axis. And so that means that some of those Earth system models predict negative growth and some of them predict positive growth. And that means that there's some level of uncertainty in what we see, which can be difficult because that is the exit area for juvenile salmon in the San Francisco Bay. And so in order to take a closer look at that question, we've calculated a daily growth potential climatology, which means we've taken that climate model, driven our ecosystem modeling framework, and calculated a growth for every single day in the upwelling season, predicted growth. Again, the error bars are going to represent the ensemble spread of those three models. On the bottom plot, you'll see there's a black line that represents the actual number of smolt going through the estuary out into San Francisco Bay per day. This is a historical data set that was collected at Chips Island, which is within the estuary, and so we can see how many fish are moving on what day of the year, and we can see that the peak of that is around the beginning of May. So historically, the most juvenile salmon have passed that site at the beginning of May, which means that early entry in San Francisco is going to be April, and late entry is going to be later into May. On the Klamath, some of our collaborators have modeled these exit rates, and their model, when I use that to create an exit curve, the peak of that curve is around the end of June, which means that in the northern areas, early entry is going to be June and late entry is going to be July. And so if we take those daily climatologies and we use them to build a growth curve, we can actually look at how quickly salmon are growing and how big they're getting over the next 100 years. And so blue is going to be the value in both the climatologies and the growth curves for the end of the century, so late century, and then the pink is going to be the value for present day. And you can see that in the Klamath, early entry salmon are growing faster and doing better at the end of the century in that first few months at sea than they are in San Francisco Bay. San Francisco Bay early entry salmon are experiencing similar growth conditions to today. But when we look at late entry in both of these regions, that story changes. So while the Klamath River salmon in their first few months in the ocean are still doing better and growing faster, the salmon that are going out through Chips Island into the San Francisco Bay and then out into the Gulf of the Farallones are actually seeing a breakdown in the conditions in their systems. So you can see that these blue values representing the potential growth at the end of the century are much lower than the pink values as we move into the summer and early fall. And so if you're in the water long enough and you're growing through these first few months of entry, you'll be in the water long enough to experience this deterioration of the system, and you'll actually end up we predict, smaller than you would today by the end of the century. And I guess I put that on the slide, but I already said it. And so the last piece of results I want to show you I'm really excited about, because this is something that we've just started getting results in for in the last few weeks. And this is what happens when years don't follow the pattern that we expect. And so we have an ensemble mean, and we can compare our yearly growth potentials to current conditions. But what happens if a year behaves anomalously? Maybe there's a year where there's really good or really bad growth relative to the mean. And so this is what this plot shows. So the purple values are going to be good anomalies, so that means that in that decade you're performing better than you are in our current period. Orange are going to be negative anomalies, which means that in that decade you're performing worse than you are in our current period. And we count up the number of events of positive and negative anomalies per decade. So how many years in a decade are really good, really, really good, or bad. And so an extreme year is going to be 2 standard deviations out from the mean, and an anomalous year is going to be 1 standard deviation out from our current day mean. And what we can see is that in northern regions of our modeling domain, the number of positive anomalous years increases. So it goes up as we move towards the end of the century. On the other hand, in our southern regions, around the San Francisco Bay and the Gulf of the Farallones, we're seeing that these positive anomalies are going down, and not only are the positive anomalies going down, the negative anomalies are increasing. So you're seeing in some decades, in the 2080s and 2090s, up to 4 years out of 10 years where you have anomalously low values. And so we see that changing ocean climate is not only going to cause shifts in areas that are conducive to good growth, it's also going to cause shifts in the number of anomalous and extreme events, depending on what area you're looking at. And not only are these changes different in space, they're also different in time. If you enter the ocean at a different time in the upwelling season, you might experience different conditions than you would from fish that entered earlier or later than you. And so we can't only look at these results in space, we have to look at them through time as well. And one thing I want to point out, especially about the anomaly work, is that a lot of times we can think about our goals for ecological forecasting in terms of fish, right? Are the salmon going to survive? Are the salmon going to be able to grow fast enough? But we also want to, when we're looking at these large timescales of something like 100 years, think about generational management on the timescales of fishermen as well. So if you are a fisherman and you work in this system and you're out there for 20 years and 8 of those 20 years are very bad, anomalously bad years, that could be enough that you might not recover in the same way that the salmon are able to later recover. And so when we're looking at ecological forecasting and we're building these large numerical models, we have to ground it in metrics that allow us to look at what the human impacts are going to be. And so I know I'm almost out of time, but the last thing I want to do is talk about what's the future of our collaborative framework and how can maybe you be involved in that. I like to think of this ecosystem model as a big Lego castle, and as more pieces get released, you can stick them on in places where it makes sense to add things. So for example, right now we have juvenile salmon growth, but we can work with groups, and we are working with groups that simulate predator distributions like birds. So what are the birds going to be doing throughout the upwelling system? Can we look at their spatial overlap with some of these juvenile salmon growth? We can also look at alternative prey. Something that predators are eating out in the water column that's the size of a juvenile salmon are other forage fish like anchovy. And so we can work with groups, and we are working with groups that can provide us with empirical data on forage fish populations out in the California current, as well as groups that are working to model these populations. Finally, some of the talks today have talked about how there's potential for metabolic processes to change over the next 100 years. And so our ecosystem model assumes that there's some level of continuity in how juvenile salmon use their metabolism. But we can collaborate with groups that look at metabolic rates and the evolution of those rates to predict whether or not that's actually what's going to happen, and to add that to our model as well. And so I want to just make a plug that models allow us to ask questions. What if the salmon enter earlier? What if they enter larger? What if they enter in a different place? If you have a question that you're thinking about, or that you have collaborators that would be invested in knowing the answer, maybe you're part of a community that wants to know what would happen if that was the case, I would love to chat with you. during this conference, or you can shoot me an email. And I don't know if I have time for questions, but that's it. Thanks for listening.
We had envisioned having a longer time for a panel discussion and had sent questions ahead of time that our speakers were game to answer. And so we kind of tried to combine ours. And so, we had started this day talking about collaborations and the importance of collaborations. So I just wanted to know, based on your experience and your research or work, where do you see potential for building collaboration at a broader scale, say coast-wide? In my case, that's where I'm interested in. With numerous communities, tribes, organizations, do you see a relevance of your work at that broader scale? So let's see if I can pass it down, and if you're ready to speak, you can just pass it along.
Yeah, I guess that something that I'm always looking for in terms of collaborations are that the sort of work and research that I do, it's really, the field component is really intensive. And so we're limited in our crew, and we spend 5 days at every site, and we're on site 24/7, and we're checking the fish at 1 a.m., 5 a.m. And so we're limited in our ability to actually go to field sites. So think about collaborations, or people who are teams who are interested in continuing this work and doing this in different locations and helping assist in the effort. And then I know this come up in some of the plenary talks is some barriers are into, such as permitting. So folks who are able to help with the permitting efforts and just collaborate and are interested in learning more about their watershed. I guess that's my plug too, is that these sorts of experiments that I do can tell you more about your fish and your local watershed. And so, yeah, if you're interested in learning more about that, come talk to me later. But see what else.
Yeah, I just want to put in a plug for, if you're an expert in something that we're not an expert in and you think your expertise could be useful, don't hesitate to email me. I am not a freshwater ecologist, but if there's a management strategy that you think would be either antagonistic or synergistic with some of the ones that I've talked about today, we want to know that, right? If salmon in your watershed are going to be entering way later and you've seen that that might not be good from an ocean standpoint, we had some talks earlier that were talking about how all parts of the ecosystem need to be managed in synergy for us to get results that are going to be successful. And so if you have a question about management or about a modeling scenario that could answer a management question, I would say don't hesitate to talk to someone.
I'd also like to say that the work that I presented is such a small snapshot of a really complicated problem. So thinking about how you can incorporate the types of thermal adaptation studies I'm doing with some of the work that you might be doing out there as well, these data sets can definitely be included together to form a more complete and full picture.
Y'all are champs for sticking around until 5 o'clock exactly. I have a few thoughts. One is the importance of mentorship, or kind of the intergenerational relationships, so that we can pass the knowledge and pass the wisdom on through these longer periods of time. It's really important, and it can be hard when some of the older folks are just so maxed out and so busy, or maybe retiring before they're ready. But I think just putting that time in and making sure that there is that kind of continuity is really important. I also think curiosity is really important, regardless of how, the size of the collaborative, is just making sure that we can hear each other, and that is so basic, and in my experience, really a factor of how much kind of personal work people have done, which feels kind of vulnerable to say out loud right now, because in my family at least, it's oh God, Natalie's such a hippie, there she goes again, and yet I think it's really key to this work being effective, and especially when we're thinking about working with tribes, working with fishermen, working with folks who are really traumatized, really hurting, and trying to bring those people in and say, hey, we know that we need to be working really on the ground right now, and we still need to be doing these larger collaboratives that have longer time frames, that have that time to build those relationships and build that trust. And the third thing I'd say is that we are in a crazy shift in terms of AI coming online. And my husband works in Silicon Valley and works with AI, and it's interesting, a lot of people have a lot of ideas about that. And it's an insanely powerful tool that I think we need to start figuring out how to utilize for the good of salmon and for the environment. And I think that's really powerful. So I think trying to be open to that and trying to bring some of those types of folks on board and saying, hey, right now we're spending over $100,000 to have kind of a course idea of how water moves in the Delta. How can we try to use AI to get that same quality of information in a matter of like minutes or seconds? So that's kind of what we're working with, and I think that there's a lot of potential there that we just need to unlock and be thoughtful about how we do it and show other groups how to use AI in a way that's just, in a way that supports the environment, and in a way that really takes into account the costs associated with AI.
I'm actually going to jump on that point because I think that is something when we talk about collaborations, right now I'm fortunate to be kind of in a space, just a very, very small piece of McLeod River reintroduction to try to support a lot of the amazing work there. And one thing that I'm trying to bring to the table is data management. And it is very funny to try and be a data manager when you have no skills. And there's AI that is, and people who have these skills, and it is now, I feel like we will have so much better communication, and we can like leverage that and then have much better, smoother data sharing, data plotting, data visualization. I know some really cool, Staff Pass is really awesome, and there's a lot of, DWRs kind of trying to do this, and I think that's actually a really big piece of the puzzle is how so many people are doing the data and doing these cool models, how that's going to be shared, and there's some really cool frameworks presented and like collaborative websites and things like that, but I think that data platform piece is actually huge. So that's what I was thinking about that too.
So we had a suite of questions, but I also know that we have the audience here that may have additional questions. So what I was thinking is that if there's those of you that do have questions, if you want to make your way towards the microphone or put your hand up, and we'll try to bring this with you to as close as we can get it to you. And while you're queuing yourself up for that, I have a quick one, which is just as we're looking at all these presentations and all of the conversations that I've had with tribal colleagues and friends and family members, one of the things that's constantly said is that if you talk to tribal people, there's a very there's an understanding that's thousands of years in the making, and there's also the solutions to the problems you're seeing. Tribal members will say, well, if you do this and you do this and you do this, then it was going to help you with leaving the system, etc. So I'm wondering if anyone has any examples of, or have you had an opportunity to collaborate? And if you haven't, no shame, but I just wanted to know if you have any collaborations that you'd like to share and how that's going, or how that could be enhanced, or what you're looking for.
Again, I'm very, very new in a small sliver of this project, but I've been learning a lot about collaboration with tribes and state agencies and federal agencies on the cloud, and I think that has been a recurring theme is kind of the tribal knowledge being always validated by like kind of the secondary stream of scientific knowledge is then kind of saying exactly what the tribal leaders are saying. And so it's kind of this parallel system of knowledge generation that's been really interesting to witness. And so I think kind of listening to that, and then also kind of generating kind of both these kinds of knowledge to kind of strengthen the story, and also the audience and things like that has been really encouraging. And so I'm, again, just a lot of learning right now, so I can't really speak from my personal experience, besides just kind of watching this collaboration and being a small part of it. But yeah, definitely seeing that happen.
That's a great question, and I've been noticing something that's really interesting. So I feel like with Trout Unlimited, we think a lot about working and checking with our tribal partners and trying to amplify their voices. Before we come out in a stance, we want to say, hey, where are our tribal partners on this? What are they thinking on this? And it's interesting, I feel like a little bit of a catch-22 associated with that is sometimes it feels like the NGOs can kind of say, oh, well, we'll put the tribes first, and then we'll let them kind of take those really hard stances, and then maybe we can be a little bit more collaborative. So that's something that I'm just kind of interested to explore a little bit, and then I think, it was, in terms of our work on the Klamath, it was really successful, but I want to make sure that as a non-tribal person working for an NGO, that the stance that I take and that my organizations take are still really cutting edge and are still pushing things forward and are in line with the tribes, and not putting them into a position that we are just like a little bit too fearful, or we don't feel like we can kind of step into that type of fight. So I'm not sure if that really gets to your question, but it's just something that I've been thinking a lot about, is how to have an effective collaboration and how to work together and build off of what we have learned in the Klamath and other areas.
Anyone else? Questions out in the audience?
I have a question for Paige. So say in your research you find that local adaptation to thermal conditions can occur at a population level, and we decide that that's a strategy we want to go forward with under climate change, and we talked about putting the strategies bringing watershed condition to, or bringing certain conditions to the watershed to try and induce local adaptation. What restoration strategy, or what suite of watershed conditions would you suggest to promote a kind of local adaptation at the population level, aside from just letting it be super hot and maybe crappy habitat to induce that? Does that make sense? It's kind of a catch-22.
That's a really good question, and so I think that actually it's sort of the opposite, where we're trying to avoid habitat conditions where local adaptation, or we're putting a lot of selective pressure on the fish. So if we can hopefully we'd develop genetic tools that we can say, okay, so we've identified this region of the genome that's associated with thermal tolerance. And then I know basically everyone I know who's doing field research these days are tagging fish and working with the fish constantly. They take fin clips. And so if we can develop a genetic tool that says something about okay, this population is really locally adapted, or this population isn't, and it lacks the genetic variation that's needed to adapt and to survive. So maybe instead of we can think about reducing the selective pressures, and so more promoting really cold prime conditions, because it's that fish population does not have the ability to adapt, without maybe introducing some sort of adaptable wheel. So in that case, we probably have to think about if it's a really thermally vulnerable and also at climate risk stream, we would have to then think about bringing those wheels into that population. Thank you for your question.
Any other questions? Well, if not, I will just answer a little bit. What I would say when it comes to all of the research that you guys are doing, that a lot of times it's peer reviewed by others that are PhD candidates, etc. I would highly recommend sharing the review with tribes in the area where you're doing the research, because even though they don't have a PhD, they're going to provide you with some knowledge that's going to be probably new.
And another group that's important to include in that process is fishing communities, the fishermen. And this is something that I moved here from Florida about 5 years ago, and something that we experienced was that while I was in Florida, there was an oil spill, right? And so the scientific community was tasked with kind of finding out what the impact of that oil spill was on fish. But there hadn't been a lot of funding in the southeast region for long-term environmental surveys, right? So we might not have had data sets on what the fish looked like, but do you know who did have that data? Was the local fishing communities. They knew exactly what those changes were and what the fish had looked like before our surveys had even begun. And so there are a lot of knowledge holders that aren't in academia, aren't in the federal landscape, that need to be included in this process because we're missing key pieces of knowledge and we're not the ultimate gatekeepers of knowledge. And so those pieces are really important, especially in areas where those communities are the ones that are going to be on the front line of the impacts of climate change, right? Like those people, fishing communities in that area were some of the first people that lost money when the oil spill happened. And so likewise with climate change, people that rely on salmon are going to be the ones that are being impacted first, and their knowledge and their legacy time in the system is important for us to consider, especially for those of us that are early career and like we're new at this, we're coming in to a system that we learned about in school, right? Like there are people that have lived and worked in this region for generations, and we can't discount that.
Any other final thoughts? Okay, thank you everyone so much for all of your presentations, for your research, for your online work. And thank you all for sticking around.
Thank you so much to our speakers. We really appreciate it.